When I first moved into the house, I told myself the isolation was a bonus. No neighbors, no noise, just a quiet place at the edge of the woods where I could work on my art in peace. The rent was suspiciously low, but I chalked that up to the sheer inconvenience of the location. A good 20-minute drive from the nearest gas station. At the time, I thought I'd stumbled onto a great deal. Now I know better. The first month was idyllic. I spent my mornings sketching by the window, where sunlight filtered through the trees, and my nights curled up with a book, the sound of crickets and rustling leaves keeping me company. The house itself was old but charming, with its creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. If there was anything eerie about it, I convinced myself it was just the unfamiliarity of living alone. Things started small. A mug I'd left on the counter appeared on the coffee table the next morning. A lamp I was sure I'd turn off would be on when I came back into the room. I blamed it on absent-mindedness at first. I've always been scatterbrained, and moving stress can mess with anyone's memory. But then, the footsteps started. The first time I heard them, I was in bed, halfway between sleep and wakefulness. At first, I thought it was just the creaks and groans of an old house settling in the night. But these weren't random. They were deliberate. Slow, heavy steps, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom. I sat up, heart hammering, and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there in the dark, clutching the blanket like it could somehow protect me. When I finally worked up the courage to check the hallway, it was empty. I locked my bedroom door after that. The next day, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been a raccoon on the roof, or my own paranoia twisting ordinary sounds into something sinister. But deep down, I didn't believe that. And when the footsteps came again the next night, this time louder and more erratic, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I called the landlord the following morning, trying to sound casual as I asked if there'd been any issues with the house. He seemed surprised by my question. "It's a sturdy place," he said, "built to last. You're not having problems, are you?" I almost told him about the footsteps, but something stopped me. I didn't want to sound crazy. And besides, what could he even do? Instead, I asked if anyone else had lived here recently. "Not for a while," he said. "The last tenant left in a hurry, but he didn't say why. Left most of his stuff behind, too. Figured he just couldn't handle being out in the sticks." That answer didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, disappearing when I turned my head. Objects continued to move. I'd find my studio door ajar when I knew I'd left it closed. And the footsteps, they came every night now, sometimes stopping right outside my door as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was listening. One night, I'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, I decided to confront whatever was happening. When the footsteps started, I threw open the door and stepped into the hallway, adrenaline drowning out my fear. The beam of my flashlight swept over empty walls and floorboards. Nothing. But then I saw it. A handprint, smudged on the far end of the hallway wall. It wasn't a normal handprint, too long, too thin, with an extra joint in each finger. My stomach turned. I couldn't explain it. Couldn't even bring myself to touch it. The next morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted out. As I was loading my car, I felt a prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I turned toward the house, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the upstairs window. A pale face with deep, hollow eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not my friends, not my family. I left it behind, or tried to. But 2 weeks after I moved into my new apartment, let's start a new story. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was at the coffee shop near my apartment. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange sensation, like I'd walked into a room and forgotten why I was there. I ordered my usual, a black coffee, no sugar, and the barista handed me a cup before I'd even spoken. "That's weird," I said, laughing nervously. "How do you know what I wanted?" The barista smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached the eyes. "You always order this," she said. Except I didn't. My usual was an iced Americano. I'd only ordered black coffee once, months ago, when they'd run out of ice. I sat by the window, sipping the coffee and staring out at the street. It was busy as usual. People walking their dogs, cars honking impatiently. But something felt off, like the rhythm of the city had been knocked slightly out of tune. The traffic lights seemed to hold red for a beat too long, and when they finally turned green, the cars hesitated before moving. The dogs on the street didn't bark, didn't sniff, didn't pull at their leashes. They just stared ahead, as though waiting for something. That's when I noticed him. A man in a dark coat stood across the street, perfectly still. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his head was tilted slightly upward, like he was looking right at me. I froze, gripping my coffee cup. For a moment, I thought he was going to cross the street, but he just stood there, unmoving, as the world shuffled around him. I glanced down to pull out my phone, and when I looked up again, he was gone. The second time it happened, I was in the grocery store. I'd gone in for bread and milk, but when I reached the bread aisle, every shelf was empty. No loaves, no rolls, not even a stray bag of hot dog buns. I wandered to the milk section and found it the same. Rows of empty shelves, the cold air from the refrigerators fogging up the glass. A store clerk appeared behind me, startling me. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was flat, polite in a way that felt rehearsed. Yeah, I said. "Where's all the milk?" He blinked, his expression blank. "Milk?" "Yeah," I said. "You know milk?" His eyes shifted, as though he didn't understand the word. Then he smiled, a slow, mechanical thing that didn't feel human. "Ah, milk? Of course. I'll check in the back." He walked away, and I never saw him again. The third time, I was at home. I'd been scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to shake the gnawing unease that had been following me for days, when I got a text from my mom. It said, "How is the cat?" I stared at the message, confused. I didn't have a cat. I never had. I replied, "I don't have a cat, Mom." Her response came almost instantly. "Of course you do. Be careful. It doesn't like being ignored." I put my phone down, my hands trembling. My apartment was silent, but suddenly it felt too silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood and walked through the rooms, checking corners, opening closets. Nothing. No cat. No anything. But when I came back to the living room, I froze. There, on the couch, was a cat. It was jet black, its fur so sleek it almost seemed to shimmer. Its eyes were a piercing yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light. It sat perfectly still, staring at me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I hadn't left the apartment. The doors and windows were locked. How had it gotten in? The cat blinked, slow and deliberate, and then it spoke. "You're getting closer," it said. Its voice was low, gravelly, and it didn't come from its mouth. It came from the air around me, vibrating in my skull. "What the hell is this?" I stammered, my back pressed against the wall. "What are you?" The cat tilted its head, its gaze unwavering. "You've noticed the cracks, haven't you? The empty shelves, the wrong orders, the frozen clocks. You're slipping through, piece by piece." "I don't understand," I whispered. "You're in between," the cat said. "Not here, not there. You're a glitch, a stray thread, and the system doesn't like stray threads." I opened my mouth to scream, to yell, to do anything, but the air seemed to thicken, pressing against me, choking the words before they could form. The cat stood, its movements fluid and unnatural, like it was made of liquid shadow. "They're coming to fix it," it said, "to erase you." I stumbled backward, the room spinning. "What do you mean erase? Erase me from what?" But the cat didn't answer. It blinked once, and then it was gone. Since that night, the cracks have grown wider. People I know don't recognize me. My favorite diner has disappeared, replaced by an empty lot that looks like it's been abandoned for years. The sun rises a few minutes later each day, and the moon is always just a sliver, no matter the phase. Last night, I woke up to find the man in the dark coat standing in my room. His hood was down, and his face was as smooth and featureless as a mannequin's. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood at the foot of my bed, watching me with a nothing where his eyes should have been. I think the cat was right. I'm slipping through something, falling into a place I... Let's start a new story. It began with a sound. Not loud, not jarring. Just a soft hum, like a fluorescent bulb warming up. I first heard it while lying in bed one night. That moment just before sleep pulls you under. It was so faint I thought it was coming from the neighbor's unit. A fridge compressor, maybe. But when I got up to investigate, the sound followed me. I stopped in the hallway, heart beating faster than it should have. The hum didn't stop. It was closer now, persistent, almost intimate, like it was tuned to my heartbeat. The thing about sounds like that, you don't notice how strange they are until they don't stop. It followed me into the kitchen, into the bathroom, into every room I retreated to. I even unplugged everything in my apartment to see if it would stop. It didn't. The hum was always there, faint but constant, a thread woven into my life. The first week, I could barely function. Sleep was a joke. Work was impossible. I even called an electrician, who checked every outlet and fixture with increasing irritation. "Nothing wrong here," he said finally. "You sure it's not in your head?" I wanted to laugh at him, but deep down, the thought scared me. What if it was in my head? And then things got weirder. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of my living room. The hum was louder than ever, almost melodic now, like the drone of an old harmonium. It seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm, pulling me toward the window. Outside, the street was eerily empty. No cars, no pedestrians, no movement. Just silence. Even the hum seemed to pause for a beat, as if it were holding its breath. Then I saw them. Figures. 3 of them, standing motionless in the parking lot below. They weren't looking up at me. They didn't have to. I could feel their attention, as sharp and oppressive as a weight on my chest. They were pale, featureless, with a strange translucency that made them look like bad digital overlays. The hum flared, a deep vibration that rattled my teeth. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the windowsill to steady myself. When I looked again, they were gone. After that, the sound wasn't just a hum anymore. It was something alive, something aware. It began changing pitch, forming shapes in the air around me. Sometimes I swore I could see ripples, faint distortions, as if reality itself were bending. Objects in my apartment started moving, small at first. A pen rolling off the counter, a chair slightly askew, but soon it escalated. One morning, I found all the doors in my apartment open. Front door, closet doors, bathroom door. Even the cabinets and drawers. They weren't just ajar either. They were flung wide, as if whatever had done it was impatient. I started leaving the lights on at night, hoping it would keep the hum at bay. It didn't. The hum loved the light. It grew stronger under the glow of my desk lamp, wrapping itself around me like a cocoon. It started speaking, not with words, but with sensations. A vibration in my bones, a pulse in my veins. It wanted me to know something, but I couldn't understand. Not yet. Desperate, I tried leaving the apartment. I thought distance might help, that maybe the hum was tied to this place. But no matter where I went, it followed. In my car, in the grocery store, even at the park where I sat on a bench until sunset, trying not to cry. The hum was always with me, and I could feel it watching. One night, it finally revealed itself. I was lying on the floor of my living room, too tired to do anything but exist when the hum began to rise. Louder and louder, until it was unbearable. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, rattling my skull. The air shimmered, and for the first time I saw it. A hole. Not a physical hole, but a tear in the space around me. It wasn't black, like you'd expect. It was bright, painfully so, a blinding void that seemed to stretch in all directions. The hum poured from it, vast and unending, vibrating with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't kindness either. And then something stepped through. It wasn't like the figures I'd seen in the parking lot. This was wrong. It had no clear form, just a shifting mass of angles and curves that didn't make sense. My eyes couldn't focus on it. Every time I tried, my brain rebelled, filling my vision with static. But I felt it, towering and immense, filling the room with a presence so overwhelming I couldn't breathe. The hum became a voice, not spoken but felt, a deep resonance that settled in my chest. "You hear me now?" I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my body paralyzed. It didn't seem to need an answer. The air shimmered again, and the hole began to close. The creature started to retreat, but not before leaving me with one final message, burned into my mind like an afterimage. When I return, you will be ready. And then it was gone. The hum is still with me, quieter now, but always there. It doesn't let me sleep much, but I've gotten used to that. What I can't get used to is the feeling, the constant, gnawing certainty that whatever stepped through that hole isn't done with me. And when it comes back, I have no idea what ready is supposed to mean. Let's start a new story. I first noticed it on the train. It was the same train I took every morning at the same time with the same faces. The guy in the brown trench coat who always read the paper. The woman with the sleek ponytail and noise-canceling headphones. The elderly couple who held hands but never spoke. Routine, predictable, comfortable, except today there was someone new. He sat at the far end of the car, staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was unremarkable at first glance, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a gray suit. But the longer I looked at him, the more wrong he seemed. Not for anything obvious. He wasn't talking to himself or acting strange. It was subtler than that, like his very presence didn't belong. No one else on the train seemed to notice him, not even when he suddenly turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were flat, unblinking, and so dark they seemed to swallow the light. My stomach dropped, and I quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in the weather app on my phone. When I glanced back, he was gone. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His face, his stillness, the way he'd looked at me like he knew me. By the time I boarded the train home, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Weird things happen on public transit all the time, right? But the next morning, he was there again. Same spot, same gray suit, same unyielding stare. This time, I refused to look away. If he wanted to make me uncomfortable, I wasn't going to let him win. The train lurched forward, and the world outside blurred into streaks of gray and green. For the first time, I realized something. The train wasn't stopping. We usually made at least 5 stops before reaching downtown, but the car kept barreling forward, unbroken. No announcements, no screech of brakes, just the steady, rhythmic hum of the wheels on the track. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The guy in the trench coat was still reading his paper. The woman with the headphones scrolled through her phone. The elderly couple stared straight ahead, hands clasped. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through the low murmur of the car. "Aren't we supposed to stop at 7th Street? No one responded. Not a glance, not a shrug, nothing. I stood up, heart racing, and walked toward the elderly couple. Didn't we just pass our stop? They didn't even blink. That's when I noticed the man in the gray suit was gone again. I moved down the car, gripping the poles for balance as the train sped forward. The doors between the cars rattled faintly, and I wondered if he'd slipped into the next car. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. Through the narrow window, I could see the next car was completely empty. No seats, no passengers, no walls, just an endless void of black, like the train had been swallowed whole. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away, almost tripping over someone's briefcase, and turned back to my seat. That's when I saw him again. The man in the gray suit was now sitting where I had been. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was calm, measured, and chillingly hollow, like it had been filtered through static. "What are you talking about?" I stammered, my throat dry. "This isn't your train." "Yes, it is." My voice rose. "I take this train every day." He tilted his head slightly, as though studying me. "Not today." Before I could respond, the train began to change. The seats warped and twisted, their edges melting like wax. The windows darkened, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered, then dimmed. The other passengers, the trench coat man, the woman with the headphones, the elderly couple, stopped moving. Their forms shimmered, flickering like bad reception, before dissolving into thin air. It was just me and him now. "What's happening?" I demanded, gripping the pole to steady myself as the floor beneath me seemed to ripple. "You got on the wrong train," he said simply. I. He raised a hand, and I fell silent. There are rules, you see. Paths, destinations. You've stepped off yours. I don't understand. You're not supposed to, he said almost kindly. But the ones who notice, the ones who linger, they complicate things. The world outside the train blurred even faster now. The gray and green replaced by streaks of red and gold, like the horizon was on fire. I could feel the air growing thinner, colder, my breath visible in front of me. What do you mean, complicate things? I whispered. You've seen too much, he said. And now, you have two choices. He stood and took a step toward me. His presence seemed to fill the entire car, pressing against me like a physical weight. You can stay here, he said. With me. Or what? I croaked. Wake up. Before I could process his words, he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch was ice cold, and the world around me shattered like glass. I woke up on the floor of my apartment, drenched in sweat, my phone buzzing faintly next to me. The screen read 6:47 a.m., the time I usually left for the train. My heart was still pounding as I sat up, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. But when I looked down, I saw it, a train ticket lying next to me. It wasn't for my usual route. It wasn't for anywhere I recognized. And the departure time was 2:16 a.m. Let's start a new story. The first time it happened, I thought it was déjà vu. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a carton of milk, when a man bumped into me. He apologized, his voice tinged with embarrassment, and I said, "It's okay," without really looking at him. But as I walked away, I froze. I knew that man, not in a casual, seen you around town way, but intimately. I knew the exact timbre of his laugh, the scar on his chin from a bike accident when he was 10, the smell of his cologne. But I didn't know why I knew him. I turned back to look at him, but he was gone. By the time I got home, the memory, or whatever it was, had settled into my mind like a splinter I couldn't reach. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd seen him somewhere before. Maybe my brain had made up the details. But then it happened again. I was in line at a coffee shop when I caught the eye of the barista. She smiled politely, the way baristas do, but the moment our eyes met, my stomach flipped. I knew her. I knew the way her hair looked wet from the rain. I knew she liked to hum along to music when she thought no one was listening. I knew she had a freckle on her left hip, but I didn't know her name. This time I asked, "Do I know you?" Her smile faltered. "I don't think so." I almost believed her, but as she handed me my drink, her fingers brushed mine, and the memories came flooding back. Late-night conversations about nothing and everything. Her laugh, soft and breathy, like she was sharing a secret. The way she'd once whispered, "Don't forget me." I stumbled out of the shop, my heart pounding. Over the next few weeks, the memories grew more frequent, more vivid. It was always the same pattern. I'd see someone, a stranger on the subway, a woman crossing the street, a child holding his mother's hand, and I'd know them. I'd remember conversations we'd never had, places we'd never been, moments we'd never shared. But none of it made sense. One night, I dreamed of a man with gray eyes and a crooked smile. We were standing on a beach, the waves lapping at our feet, and he was holding my hand. "You're forgetting again," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Who are you?" I asked, but before he could answer, I woke up. The next morning, I saw him on the street. I was too shocked to speak, and by the time I worked up the courage to approach him, he was gone. But the dream lingered, haunting me. The way he'd looked at me, like I was supposed to remember, like I'd let him down. That's when I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down every face, every memory, every moment that felt out of place. Soon, the pages were filled with names and details I couldn't explain. A woman named Anna who loved sunflowers. A boy named Theo who used to build forts out of blankets. A man named Carlos who always tapped his foot when he was nervous. I didn't know any of them, but they felt like they were mine. The more I wrote, the worse it got. I started to feel like I was living in two worlds at once. This one, and another that was slipping through my fingers like sand. Sometimes, I'd look in the mirror and not recognize my own face. One night, I woke up standing in my kitchen, my hands covered in dirt. There was mud on the floor, leading back to the front door. When I checked my phone, I found photos I didn't remember taking. Pictures of a forest, a river, a cabin I'd never seen before. And in every photo, there was a figure in the distance, watching me. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But I wasn't alone. The people I'd been remembering, they started noticing me too. It was subtle at first. A man on the bus staring at me a second too long. A woman at the park who waved like we were old friends. A little girl who whispered, "It's you," before her mother dragged her away. I started avoiding crowds, afraid of who I might see, afraid of who might see me. Then, last week, I found the note. It was tucked into my mailbox, written on yellowed paper in handwriting that felt painfully familiar. Do you remember now? I didn't, but I wanted to. The next day, I followed the dirt trail again. I didn't know where it led, but I felt drawn to it like a thread pulling me forward. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, and then I saw it. The cabin from the photos. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, the door hanging slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The room was empty, except for a single mirror leaning against the far wall. And in the mirror, I saw them. All of them. The faces I'd been seeing, the people I'd been remembering. They stood behind me, their expressions a mix of relief and sorrow. "You came back," one of them whispered. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You left us," another said. "But we never left you." I turned to look at them, but there was no one there. Only the mirror, and my reflection staring back at me with tears in its eyes. That's when I realized the truth. They weren't strangers. They were pieces of me. People I'd been, lives I'd lived. Mamuria zideburia. The cabin, the forest, the dreams, they weren't real. Or maybe they were more real than anything else. I don't know. Let's start a new story. The little girl came to my door on a Wednesday evening, just after dusk. I was in the middle of reheating leftover lasagna when I heard the knock. 3 quick raps, almost timid. It startled me. No one ever visited my house. I opened the door to find her standing on the porch, small and pale, her blonde hair tangled and messy as if she'd been running through the woods. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her eyes were wide and glassy, the way kids look after they've cried too much. She wore a dress that might have been pink once, now stained with dirt and torn at the hem. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Every rational part of me screamed no. It was like an unwritten rule. Don't let strange children into your house at night. It felt wrong, but the way she stared up at me, clutching the stuffed rabbit in her arms like it was the only thing holding her together, I couldn't say no. I stepped aside, and she shuffled in without hesitation, her bare feet leaving faint smudges on the hardwood floor. "Are you lost?" I asked, closing the door behind her. She nodded, her eyes scanning the room like she was checking for something or someone. "Where's your family?" "They're coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sat down on the couch, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter. Something about her made my skin prickle. Maybe it was the way she seemed so calm, so certain, like she wasn't scared at all. Most lost kids would be crying or frantic, but not her. She sat perfectly still, staring at the empty fireplace like she was waiting for something to crawl out of it. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Ellie," she said. "Okay, Ellie. I'm going to call someone to help you." "Okay. Maybe the police." "No," she said sharply, her head snapping toward me. Her wide eyes were suddenly fierce, almost pleading. "No police." I froze. "Why not?" "They won't help. They never help." I didn't know what to say to that. My phone was on the counter, but something about her tone made me hesitate. "What about your parents?" I asked. "Do they know where you are?" Ellie shook her head. "They don't look for me anymore." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean? Did they lose you?" She blinked, her expression unreadable. "They don't know I'm gone." The air in the room felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on me. I took a step closer, trying to keep my tone steady. "Ellie, where are you from?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the window. "They're almost here." My heart skipped a beat. "Who's almost here?" She didn't look at me. "The ones who come when it's dark." My chest tightened. I glanced at the window. but all I saw was the faint reflection of the room, distorted by the night. "Ellie," I said carefully, "what are you talking about?" "They're coming for me," she said simply. "They always do." A chill ran down my spine. "Who are they?" "The shadows," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "They want to take me back." Something outside caught my eye, a flicker of movement at the edge of the yard. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the wind stirring the branches of the trees. When I turned back to Ellie, she was standing. Her stuffed rabbit dangled from one hand, her gaze fixed on the door. "They're here," she whispered. Before I could respond, the lights flickered. Just once, a quick stutter, but enough to make my heart leap into my throat. I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside. The yard was empty. No figures, no shadows, just the same trees, the same darkness. "I don't see anything," I said, turning back to her. But she wasn't on the couch anymore. "Ellie," I called, my voice cracking. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to cut through the darkness. The beam of light wavered as my hands shook. "Ellie, where are you?" A noise came from the corner of the room, a soft, wet sound like something dragging across the floor. I turned the flashlight toward it, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. A long, twisting shape that disappeared as quickly as it had come. The air was thick, suffocating. The silence felt alive. "Ellie," I whispered, my voice trembling. Something brushed past me, cold, like the whisper of wind through an open door. I spun around, the flashlight catching nothing but the empty space where Ellie had stood. Then I heard it, her voice, faint and distant, coming from the front porch. "They're here." I ran to the door, throwing it open. The yard was empty, the street beyond it deserted. Ellie was gone. The only thing left was her stuffed rabbit, lying on the porch, its fur damp and matted with something dark. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't call the police. What would I even tell them? That a girl appeared out of nowhere, spoke of shadows, and vanished? But now, every evening as the sun sets, I swear I hear it. The faint sound of footsteps outside, the soft knock of her tiny fist against my door. And each time, I sit in silence. Let's start a new story. When I first saw the mirror, I thought it was beautiful. I found it at a secondhand shop tucked between a stack of old vinyl records and a box of mismatched silverware. The frame was ornate, carved with painted a tarnished gold, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. The glass itself was slightly warped, giving reflections a faintly rippled look, like staring into a pool of water. It was $40, a steal for something that elegant. The shopkeeper looked hesitant when I brought it to the counter. "You sure about this one?" she asked, her fingers lingering on the edge of the frame. "Yeah," I said, laughing. "Why? Is it haunted or something?" She didn't laugh back. "Just be careful with it," she said, sliding the mirror into a sheet of brown paper. I shrugged it off. People love attaching spooky stories to old things. It's how they sell them. When I got the mirror home, I hung it in my bedroom. It was heavy, and the frame had those little hooks on the back that required some effort to line up with nails in the wall. By the time I got it straight, I was sweating, but it looked perfect. The room felt bigger, brighter, with the mirror reflecting the sunlight that streamed in during the afternoon. The first odd thing happened that night. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I noticed a faint glow coming from the mirror. Not the kind of glow from a street light or a passing car. This was softer, almost like moonlight, except the curtains were drawn and the moon wasn't out. The glow seemed to shift slightly, like it was moving just beneath the surface of the glass. I sat up, blinking. The glow disappeared. I stared at the mirror for a long time, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal. The mirror reflected the room as it should. The bed, the dresser, the framed prints on the wall. But as I stood brushing my hair in front of it, something caught my eye. It was subtle at first, like a flicker at the edge of the glass. When I leaned closer, I realized the reflection didn't quite match what was behind me. The room in the mirror looked identical to mine, but the little details were wrong. The clock on the bedside table showed a different time, 3:47. though my clock said 8:12. The book on my nightstand, which I'd left open to a random page, was closed in the reflection. Even the angle of the sunlight was off, as if the room in the mirror belonged to another time of day entirely. I reached out, touching the glass. It was cool, solid, unremarkable. When I pulled my hand back, the reflection was normal again. Over the next few days, things escalated. The glow returned each night, growing brighter and lasting longer. Shadows began to move in the mirror, faint and indistinct, like figures pacing just out of reach. I tried ignoring it, chalking it up to overthinking or stress, but the unease gnawed at me. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against wood. But soon it grew louder. One night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the mirror. They were deliberate, slow, echoing through the room. I turned on the lamp, my heart racing, and stared at the glass. The glow was back, but this time I saw something in it. A figure stood in the reflection, obscured by the warped glass, its features too blurry to make out. It was tall, hunched slightly, and entirely still. I whipped around, but the room behind me was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. The next day, I tried to get rid of it. I pulled it off the wall and carried it down to the curb, setting it beside a pile of garbage bags. But when I got back to my apartment, the mirror was leaning against the wall, exactly where it had been before. I tried again, this time driving it to a donation center on the other side of town. But when I returned, the mirror was waiting for me in the hallway. By then, I was too terrified to sleep in my bedroom. I moved a mattress into the living room and avoided the mirror altogether. But it didn't matter. The glow started to seep under the door at night, and the footsteps followed me no matter where I slept. One night, in a fit of desperation, I smashed it. I took a hammer and shattered the glass, the shards scattering across the floor like ice. For a moment, I felt relief. But when I looked closer, I realized the pieces weren't reflecting the room. Each shard showed something different. Images of places I didn't recognize. A forest lit by a sickly green light. A vast, empty field under a black sky. A dimly lit hallway that stretched endlessly into darkness. And in the largest piece, the figure stood again, clearer now. Its face was pale and featureless, save for two dark hollows where eyes should have been. The shards began to hum, a low vibration that filled the room. I stumbled back, dropping the hammer. The largest piece twitched, then slid across the floor as if pulled by some invisible force. One by one, the shards began to reassemble themselves, the cracks sealing as if they had never been there. When the mirror was whole again, the figure stepped through. I don't know how to describe what happened next. My mind has tried to block it out, but I remember the weight of its presence, the way the air seemed to bend around it. It didn't speak, but I could feel its intentions pressing into my thoughts like knives. When I woke up, the mirror was gone. The bedroom was empty, the wall bare. But every night since, I've seen faint glimpses of that glow, reflected in windows, puddles, even the surface of my phone screen. I know it's still watching, and I know one day it's going to find a way back. Let's start a new story. I don't know why I opened the door. Maybe it was because the knock sounded urgent, 3 sharp raps, then a pause followed by 2 more. It was almost rhythmic, like a signal. It was late, close to midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. But I'd been half asleep on the couch, the glow of the muted TV flickering in the dark, and in my groggy state, curiosity outweighed caution. When I opened it, there was no one there, just a small, unmarked package sitting neatly on my welcome mat. I stepped into the hallway and glanced in both directions, but it was empty. No retreating footsteps, no elevators din. Whoever left it had vanished. My apartment building wasn't big. 3 floors, no security cameras, and tenants who mostly kept to themselves. It wasn't unheard of for deliveries to end up at the wrong door. But this package wasn't addressed to anyone. It was light, too light to be anything substantial. I debated leaving it there, but something about the way it was positioned, precisely centered, the corners crisp and unwrinkled, nagged at me. It didn't look like an accidental drop-off. It looked intentional. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and brought it inside. I set it on the coffee table and stared at it for a long time, my anxiety growing. Finally, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and slit the tape. Inside was a single item, a folded piece of paper. No letter, no explanation, just a printed photo. The photo was of me, sitting at my desk at work, headphones on, staring at my computer screen. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend, Kayla. When she picked up, I was already pacing the room. Someone left something at my door. I blurted, my voice shaky. It's a picture of me, at work, taken without me knowing. Wait, what? She said, alarmed. Who would do that? Did you call the building manager? No, not yet. I don't even know if they'd do anything. This place doesn't have cameras. Okay, that's seriously creepy. You should call the police. I hesitated. It felt like overkill, but Kayla was right. Someone had gone to the trouble of taking my picture and delivering it to my door. That wasn't normal. Yeah, okay. I'll call, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. After we hung up, I stared at the photo again, my mind racing. I didn't recognize the angle it was taken from. It wasn't from inside my office, and it wasn't a selfie. It must have been shot through the window of the building next door. The thought made my skin crawl. The police weren't much help. An officer came by, took my statement, and left with the photo and the packaging. He was polite but skeptical, like he thought I was overreacting. Probably just a prank, he said. Let us know if anything else happens. Anything else? As if this wasn't already enough. I tried to sleep that night, but every creak of the building made me sit up, heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. I tiptoed to the peephole and peered out, but it was empty. Still, I double-checked the locks and wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. The next day at work, I couldn't concentrate. Every time I glanced at the window, I felt like someone was watching me. By lunchtime, I was jumpy and irritable, snapping at coworkers who asked if I was okay. I told myself I was being paranoid, and then I found the second package. It was waiting for me when I got home, placed exactly where the first one had been. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, noting that it was slightly heavier this time. Inside, there was another photo. This one was taken at night, through my apartment window. In the photo, I was asleep on the couch, the same couch I'd been dozing on when I found the first package. My blood ran cold. I hadn't closed the curtains that night. I always told myself there was no point. The building across the street was under construction, the windows dark and empty. But someone had been there watching me, taking pictures. I called the police again, but their reaction was the same. No fingerprints, no witnesses. Just let us know if it escalates. Escalates. I wanted to scream. How much worse did it have to get before they took it seriously? Kayla insisted I stay with her for a few days, and I agreed. But even in her guest room, I couldn't relax. I started noticing things, small, insignificant details that I wouldn't have thought twice about before. A man standing too long at the corner across from my building. A car idling in front of the coffee shop I frequented. A shadow that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The third package came 2 days later. This time, it was delivered to Kayla's apartment. She found it first, sitting on the doorstep when she went out to grab the mail. Is this for you? She asked, holding it up. My stomach turned. Don't open it, I said, grabbing it from her hands. Inside was another photo, but this one wasn't of me. It was of Kayla, standing in her kitchen, her back turned to the camera. My hands shook as I showed it to her. She stared at it, her face pale. How did they even know I lived here? She whispered. I didn't have an answer. That night, we didn't sleep. We stayed up with every light in the apartment on, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Around 4 a.m., there was another knock at the door. Not urgent this time, just 3 slow, deliberate taps. We didn't open it. Instead, we called the police. But by the time they arrived, whoever had knocked was gone, leaving nothing behind. The packages stopped after that. No more photos, no more knocks. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Whoever it was, they hadn't been caught. They were still out there watching, waiting. I moved to a new city a month later. New job, new apartment, new everything. For a while, I let myself believe it was over. Until last night, I came home to find a small, unmarked package sitting neatly in front of my door. My new door in my new city. Inside was a photo of... Let's start a new story. The clock in the town square struck 3 times as Evie parked her car on the gravel shoulder. The road leading up to the house was narrow and winding, flanked by trees that seemed to bow over it like silent sentinels. She checked her phone one last time. No new messages, just the cryptic text from her mother 2 days ago. You need to see this for yourself. It's about Dad. Her mother's voicemail had been equally vague. I can't explain it over the phone. You'll think I'm crazy, but I need you to come home. Home. The word felt alien now. She hadn't been back since her father's funeral 3 years ago, when the house was crowded with casseroles and awkward condolences. The memory of her father's face, pale and still, made her stomach knot as she got out of the car. The house hadn't changed much. The paint was peeling in the same spots. The roof still sagged slightly on the west side. But the air around it felt heavier somehow, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Evie climbed the porch steps, her boots creaking against the wood, and knocked. Her mother answered almost immediately. She looked thinner, her hair pulled into a haphazard bun, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. You came, she said, her voice a mix of relief and hesitation. You didn't give me much choice, Evie replied, stepping inside. The familiar scent of lavender and cedar greeted her, though it was faint now, overshadowed by something metallic and sharp. Her mother locked the door behind her, a motion so deliberate it made Evie pause. Okay, she said, dropping her bag by the coat rack. What's this all about? Her mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she motioned for Evie to follow her into the living room. The furniture was the same, but the walls were different. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe more, pinned in overlapping layers. They climbed from the baseboards to the ceiling, a chaotic collage of faces and places. What the hell? Evie whispered, stepping closer. The photos weren't framed. They were torn from albums, some curled at the edges, others yellowed with age. But it wasn't their condition that unsettled her. It was the subject. They were all of her father. Some were familiar. Her parents' wedding, family vacations, her father laughing over the grill at a backyard party. But others were strange, taken from angles that didn't make sense. Her father at the mailbox, her father walking to his car, her father sitting alone in the park. Some were from decades before Evie was born, others from just weeks before his death. Mom, her voice trailed off. She turned to find her mother staring at the wall, her hands clenched into fists. It started a month ago, her mother said quietly. I found one of these tucked in my Bible. A photo I'd never seen before, taken long before I met him. I thought maybe it had been stuck there by mistake, but then more started showing up. In drawers, under the couch, even in the mailbox. Evie tried to process what she was hearing. Are you saying someone's breaking in and leaving these here? Her mother nodded slowly, but her expression suggested something deeper, something unspoken. That's what I thought at first. But, Evie, some of these are from after he died. Evie's blood ran cold. That's not possible. Her mother didn't argue. Instead, she walked over to the far wall and pulled down a photo from near the top. This one was taken last week, she said, handing it to Evie. The picture showed her father standing in the backyard. He was wearing the same blue flannel shirt he always wore when raking leaves. But the date written on the back, in looping handwriting that wasn't her mother's, was from just 5 days ago. Evie's first instinct was to call it a trick, a prank, a cruel joke. But as she stared at the photo, she couldn't find any signs of forgery. Her father's stance, the way the sunlight hit his hair, even the slight smudge on his glasses, it was all exactly as she remembered. This is insane, Evie said, handing the photo back. You should have called the police. Her mother let out a hollow laugh. And tell them what? That my dead husband is stalking me? They'd haul me off to the psych ward. She had a point, but that didn't make this any less disturbing. Have you seen it? Evie asked hesitantly. Her mother hesitated, then nodded. Once, in the yard. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked into the woods. The woods. They'd always seemed peaceful to Evie as a child. A place where her father used to take her for long walks to point out deer tracks or teach her the names of trees. But now, they felt ominous, their shadows stretching across the backyard like claws. "We need to figure out who's doing this," Evie said firmly. "Maybe someone's trying to mess with you. An old neighbor, someone from Dad's past." Her mother didn't look convinced. "Whoever or whatever it is, it knows things, Evie. Things no one else would know." Before Evie could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Both women froze, their eyes meeting. The knock came again, louder this time. Evie moved toward the door, her pulse racing. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, just the dark silhouette of the porch. "Don't open it," her mother whispered, clutching her arm. Evie hesitated, but then a flicker of movement caught her eye. On the porch, just visible in the moonlight, was a photograph. She unlocked the door and snatched it up before quickly shutting it again. The photo was new, the edges crisp. It showed the two of them, Evie and her mother, standing in the living room, staring at the wall of photos. Evie turned it over. The back was blank except for a single word written in the same looping script as before. "Look." "What does it mean?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. Evie didn't answer. Her eyes drifted to the far end of the living room, where a mirror hung above the fireplace. For the first time, she noticed something wrong with the reflection. The room behind them wasn't empty. Let's start a new story. It was one of those dreary, late-night rides when the train car is nearly empty, save for a handful of strangers too tired to even pretend they're not staring at each other. She stood out immediately. Her long, dark hair was tangled like she hadn't brushed it in days, and her clothes hung loose on her frame, as though she'd picked them up from a thrift store and hadn't bothered to check the sizes. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was her eyes. Wide, unblinking, darting around the car like she was scanning for something. Or someone. I was trying not to look at her when she sat down directly across from me. The subway car rattled and groaned as it sped through the tunnel, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Then she leaned forward and asked, "Have you seen him?" Her voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was an urgency to her words that made my skin prickle. Who?" I asked, taken aback. She glanced over her shoulder, her movements quick and jerky, like a bird. "The man with the teeth," she said. "The teeth?" I repeated, confused. She nodded. "He always smiles too wide, like he has too many teeth. You'd know him if you saw him." I didn't know how to respond, so I just shook my head. "No, sorry. I haven't seen anyone like that." Her shoulders slumped, and she sat back, crossing her arms like she was trying to fold into herself. "He follows me sometimes. I thought he might be here." I tried to focus on my phone after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every few seconds, I'd glance up, and she'd still be sitting there, staring at me with those wide, darting eyes. When the train pulled into my stop, I practically bolted out of the car, relieved to be rid of her. But she was there again the next night. This time, she didn't sit across from me. She stayed at the far end of the car, watching. I tried to ignore her, telling myself it was just a coincidence. New York is huge, but people cross paths all the time. Still, when I got off at my stop, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting her to follow. She didn't. Not that night. The third time I saw her, it wasn't on the subway. It was in the bodega near my apartment. She was standing by the refrigerators, staring into the glass like she couldn't decide what to buy. When I walked in, her head snapped up and her eyes locked onto mine. "Hey," she said, her voice low. "You should be careful." I froze. "What?" Her lips twitched, almost like she was smiling, but not quite. "He likes people like you. The quiet ones." I didn't ask her what she meant. I just turned and left, abandoning my plan to buy groceries. After that, I started seeing her everywhere. On the subway, at the coffee shop I went to every morning, even across the street from my building. She never approached me again, but she didn't have to. The way she watched me, her unblinking eyes tracking my every move, was enough. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. I live on the 5th floor, so my first thought was that it had to be the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Top, top, top. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there, just the faint glow of the streetlights and the empty alley below. I told myself I was imagining things, but when I turned away from the window, I noticed something on the glass. 3 smudged fingerprints, long and thin, like someone had pressed their hand there moments before. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to change my routine. I took a different train, went to a different coffee shop, even walked an extra 10 blocks just to throw off the possibility of being followed. For a while it worked. I didn't see her for 3 days, and I started to convince myself that maybe she was just some unhinged stranger who'd lost interest in me. But then, on the 4th day, I came home to find my apartment door unlocked. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I was sure of it. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any signs of an intruder. Nothing looked out of place. No drawers open, no furniture moved, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, stagnant. And then I saw it. On the coffee table, there was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from behind as I walked down the street. My headphones were in, my head slightly bowed, completely oblivious to the camera. Written on the back, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "He's watching you." I packed a bag and left that night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not my friends, not my boss. I booked a cheap motel room 2 towns over and spent the next week jumping every time the phone rang or I heard footsteps in the hall. One night, as I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, I heard it again, tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't the window. It was the door. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The tapping came again, louder this time. Claire. It was her voice. Soft, almost sing-song. "I need to tell you something," she said. "He's here. He's with you now." I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in that bed, waiting for the sound of the door opening. But it never did. When I finally worked up the courage to check the peephole, the hallway was empty. I don't know who she was or what she wanted. I don't even know if she was the real danger, or if he was. All I know is that I haven't stopped running. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tap, tap, tap. Let's start a new story. In the town of Glencroft, there was a cafe that shouldn't exist. Tucked at the end of a cobblestone alley that didn't appear on any map, Cafe Penumbra sat behind a wrought iron gate perpetually creaking in the breeze. No one knew who owned it, but locals swore it had always been there, though no one could quite recall their first visit. People didn't stumble upon Penumbra by accident. You found it only when you needed it, though you might not have known you needed it at all. Ellie found it on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky seemed like it would collapse under its own weight. She wasn't looking for a cafe, just a quiet place to breathe. Her phone was still buzzing in her pocket, texts from her sister about mom's hospital bills, voicemails from her boss hinting at unpaid overtime, and one pointed email from her landlord with the subject line, "Urgent." Her head ached, and her chest felt like a vice. The alley looked like a reprieve. Quiet. Empty. She hadn't seen the cafe sign at first. But then the gate creaked, and she saw the letters, curling gold script against a black wooden board. Cafe Penumbra. Coffee. Answers. Escape. Escape. That word felt like a dare. She pushed open the gate. The cafe was smaller than she'd expected, dimly lit and impossibly cozy. The walls were lined with mismatched bookshelves, some of them tilting precariously. A handful of tables were scattered across the room, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain. "Welcome," said a voice. Ellie turned to see a man behind the counter, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and gray eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes. His name tag read Cormac, but it was etched in wood, not plastic, and the letters seemed to shift if she looked at them too long. Thanks," she said awkwardly. "Do I just sit?" "Your order's already prepared," Cormac said, sliding a steaming mug across the counter toward her. She frowned. "I didn't. Everyone's first drink is on the house," he interrupted, his smile kind but firm. Ellie hesitated before picking up the mug. It was warm, heavier than she expected. The liquid inside wasn't coffee or tea. It shimmered faintly, a swirling blend of deep indigo and silver, like liquid starlight. It smelled like, well, she couldn't describe it. It smelled like nostalgia and comfort and the way sunlight felt on her skin as a child. "What is this?" she asked. "Exactly what you need," he said. "Go on. Take a seat." Ellie didn't argue. She chose a small table near the window, though the view outside was just a wall of mist. The first sip of the drink hit her like a memory she didn't know she'd forgotten. Warmth spread through her chest, unraveling knots she hadn't realized were there. She lost track of time. The cafe seemed to exist outside of it, anyway. A clock on the wall ticked backward, and her phone showed no signal, though she swore it hadn't died. Other patrons sat scattered around the room, each wrapped in their own bubble of thought. At the table nearest to her, a man in a rumpled suit stared into a half-empty glass, his eyes brimming with something unsaid. An elderly woman in a shawl clutched a cup with trembling hands, whispering softly to someone who wasn't there. Ellie took another sip of her drink. This time, the warmth was sharper, accompanied by a flicker of something behind her eyes. Not a vision exactly, but a sensation, a choice she hadn't made, a road not taken, a version of her life that could have existed if she'd turned left instead of right, said yes instead of no. She blinked hard, and the sensation faded, but it left her with a strange, bittersweet ache. She turned back to Cormac, who was watching her with quiet curiosity. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice shaking. His smile widened, just enough to be unsettling. "A café." "That's not an answer." "Sure it is. You just don't like it." Ellie pushed back her chair, the scrape of wood on tile echoing louder than it should have. "I don't think I should be here." Cormac tilted his head. "You came because you needed to. Everyone who walks through that gate does. The question is whether you leave with what you came for." "I didn't come for anything," she snapped. "Didn't you?" He gestured to her mug. "You've tasted what might have been. It's up to you whether you want to forget it or follow it." "What are you talking about?" she demanded. But even as she spoke, she knew. The drink, the cafe, the strange stillness of this place, they weren't random. They were offering her a choice. And suddenly, she realized she didn't want to go back. Back to the overdue bills and the endless grind and the feeling of always falling short. Cormac reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the surface. Her name was written on it in the same gold script as the sign outside. "Your next step," he said simply. Ellie stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. "What happens if I don't take it?" "You walk back out that door, finish your laundry, go to work tomorrow, and keep living. Same as always." "And if I do?" Cormac's smile softened, just slightly. "Then you find out what you've been missing." Ellie hesitated, her hand hovering over the envelope. In the silence, she thought of the faces she'd seen at the other tables. The man in the suit, the elderly woman. Choices they'd made or hadn't made. She picked up the envelope. Outside, the mist had cleared, but the cobblestone alley was gone. She stepped out into sunlight, the warmth brushing her skin like a new beginning. The cafe was no longer behind her, just a blank wall. But in her pocket, the envelope felt impossibly heavy, like a promise waiting to be unwrapped. Let's start a new story. It started on a Wednesday when the reflection in the mirror blinked, and I didn't. I was washing my hands in the office bathroom after lunch, staring at myself like I always did during these midday lulls. My co-workers were milling around in the break room, their voices faint through the walls. I turned off the faucet and looked up, and there it was, my reflection, frozen in mid-blink while I stared wide-eyed. It lasted less than a second, but my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on the stairs. My brain scrambled to rationalize it. A trick of light. I was tired. My eyes were dry from staring at spreadsheets all morning. I splashed water on my face, avoided looking in the mirror again, and went back to my desk. The next time, it wasn't my reflection. It was everyone else's. I was walking through the city after work, dodging the usual swarm of commuters. The reflective glass of a high-rise caught my eye, and for some reason, I turned to look. The people bustling around me were reflected normally, heads down, bags in hand, faces blank with exhaustion. But in the glass, none of them were moving. The reflections stood stock still, staring out at the street like wax figures. I froze, a shiver running through me. I turned back to the street. The real people were moving as usual, oblivious to the bizarre standoff happening in their reflections. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking, clutching my bag tighter. As I passed another pane of glass, I glanced sideways. The reflections were still staring, but this time, All of them were staring at me. By the time I got home, my nerves were raw. I spent the night with the blinds shut and every mirror in my apartment covered. I told myself it was nothing, a weird coincidence, maybe some glitch in my brain after a long day. But that didn't explain the heaviness that settled in my chest, or the way the silence in my apartment felt like it was listening. Over the next few days, I started noticing it everywhere. Reflections acting on their own, shadows moving out of sync. In the elevator at work, I caught my reflection staring at me even after I looked away. In a shop window, I saw a man's reflection turn and grin at me, though he kept walking straight ahead. No one else seemed to notice. People carried on like nothing was wrong, but I could feel it, a growing tension in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Then came the crack. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound like glass being stressed to its breaking point. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, and turned toward the mirror. There was a hairline crack running down the center of my reflection. I reached out instinctively, but the glass felt smooth under my fingertips. The crack wasn't real. It was only in the image, bisecting my face like a fault line. I stepped back, trembling, and that's when my reflection moved. It tilted its head, the crack deepening, splintering into spiderweb patterns. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it smiled. I don't remember falling asleep that night. I woke up on the floor, the toothbrush still clutched in my hand. The mirror was intact. No sign of the crack or the sinister grin. But the sense of unease stayed with me, a low hum in the back of my mind. It escalated after that. Mirrors became impossible to avoid. They were everywhere, in elevators, in store windows, in the rearview mirror of my car. And every time, there was something wrong, a reflection that lingered too long, a movement that didn't match, a shadow in the background that didn't belong. One evening, I was standing at my kitchen sink when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Then I saw it, the reflection in the window over the sink. It wasn't me. It looked like me, but it wasn't. Its movements were too slow, too deliberate, like it was imitating me without understanding how. It raised a hand, but instead of waving, it pressed its palm against the glass, staring at me with a face that was just a little too calm. I stumbled backward, the plate in my hand shattering on the floor. After that, I stopped looking at reflections entirely. I avoided mirrors, turned off my phone's selfie camera, and walked with my head down when passing shop windows. But it didn't help. The feeling of being watched followed me everywhere, a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I stopped sleeping, stopped talking to people, stopped going to work. My apartment became a prison. Every reflective surface, a potential threat. The night it happened, I was sitting in the dark, the TV playing static in the background. I hadn't covered the bathroom mirror. Some part of me was too tired, too defeated to care anymore. When I glanced toward the hallway, I saw it. My reflection, standing in the bathroom doorway, watching me. But I wasn't there. I was sitting on the couch. It stepped into the room, its movements smooth and unnatural, like a predator stalking prey. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It crouched in front of me, tilting its head like it was studying me. Up close, its face wasn't quite right. Too symmetrical, too sharp. Its eyes glittered with a malice that felt ancient, like it had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. "You should have stopped looking," it said. Its voice wasn't mine. It was hollow, echoing, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I don't know what happened after that. When I woke up, I was in the bathroom, staring into the mirror. My reflection was back to normal, mimicking my every move. But something felt different, off. The weight in my chest was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. It wasn't until I left the apartment that I realized the truth. People looked at me differently now, like they couldn't quite focus on me, like I was just a flicker at the edge of their vision. In the reflective surfaces I passed, I saw myself, but I wasn't quite there. My face blurred at the edges, like a smudge on a lens. I had become the reflection. Or maybe I always was. Let's start a new story. The first time I met Will, I was carrying 2 bags of groceries up 3 flights of stairs, sweating and muttering curses at the universe. I was half a flight from my door when he appeared behind me, practically out of nowhere. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice warm and casual, like we'd been friends for years. I startled, almost dropping one of the bags. He chuckled softly and stepped back, raising his hands like he was surrendering. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I live next door, 306. Just moved in." I glanced at him. He had one of those friendly, non-threatening faces, with soft brown eyes and an easy smile. He looked about my age, early 30s, dressed in jeans and a faded hoodie. "Harmless. I'm good, thanks," I said, shifting the bags awkwardly. He nodded, but instead of leaving, he lingered at the top of the stairs, waiting while I fumbled with my keys. "Well, by the way," he said as I finally got the door open. "Nice to meet you. Aaron," I said reluctantly. "Aaron," he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. "Well, if you ever need help with the bags or anything, just knock." "Thanks," I mumbled, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. Over the next few weeks, Will became a constant presence in my life. He was always in the hallway when I came home, waving as he carried a toolbox or a bag of groceries. He'd strike up conversations about the weather, the building's quirks, or the best pizza spots in the neighborhood. At first, I found it charming, refreshing, even in a city where neighbors rarely spoke to each other. But then little things started to bother me. One morning, I stepped out to find a cup of coffee waiting on the floor outside my door. A note taped to it read, "Figured you could use a pick-me-up. Will." It was a nice gesture, but something about it felt off. I hadn't mentioned my caffeine addiction to him, or to anyone in the building. Then there was the time he asked about my job. We'd been chatting about nothing in particular when he said, "So, you work late a lot, huh? Must be tough getting home at 10 every night." I froze. I never told him my schedule. "How do you know that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Oh, I just noticed things. You know, hearing you come up the stairs and all." It was a plausible explanation, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. One night, I came home to find Will sitting on the stairs outside his apartment, flipping through a paperback. He looked up as I approached and smiled. "Rough day?" he asked. "Yeah," I muttered, brushing past him. "Hey, Aaron," he called after me. "You ever feel like someone's watching you?" I stopped cold, my hand on the doorknob. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his smile fading. "Sometimes I get this feeling, like I'm not alone, even when I should be. It's probably just paranoia, right?" I didn't answer. That night, I triple-checked my locks before going to bed. The next few days were quiet. Will wasn't in the hallway, and I didn't hear his usual comings and goings. I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd just been trying to be friendly and I'd overreacted. But then, late one night, I woke to a sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind. My building faced an alley, and the old fire escapes rattled whenever the weather turned. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate tapping. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and edged toward the window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the thought of anyone being outside the window was absurd. But when I pulled back the curtain, I saw it, a handprint smeared against the glass. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been there was gone. They checked the alley and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I decided to install a camera in the living room, pointing toward the window. The next night, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was uneventful, just shadows shifting as cars passed in the street below. But around 2:14 a.m., the camera caught something. A figure climbed onto the fire escape, moving with eerie precision. They crouched by the window, staring inside, their face obscured by a hoodie. And then, slowly, they pressed a hand against the glass. My stomach dropped. The hoodie looked familiar. Too familiar. I knocked on Will's door the next day, my pulse racing. He opened it almost immediately, grinning as though he'd been waiting for me. "Hey, Aaron, everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just wanted to see if you've noticed anything weird around the building lately." His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Weird how?" "Like someone on the fire escape at night." He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. "Can't say I have, but if you're worried, you should let me know. I can keep an eye out for you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Instead, I thanked him and went back to my apartment, where I spent the rest of the day packing. I moved out 2 days later, breaking my lease and leaving no forwarding address. I didn't tell anyone, not the landlord, not my co-workers, not even my friends. A week after I settled into my new place, I found a package outside my door. No return address. Inside was a single item. The paperback I had been reading that night on the stairs. Tucked between the pages was a note. I told you I noticed things. Let's start a new story. I was washing dishes, staring out the window at the parking lot below, when I was suddenly somewhere else. It wasn't a daydream, and it wasn't like when a random thought pulls you away for a second. No, this was real. I was walking down a gravel path, the sun heavy on my shoulders. I could smell freshly cut grass and feel the grit crunching under my shoes. I wasn't thinking, I was experiencing. But the strangest part was that I knew this path. I remembered walking it 1,000 times before, even though I'd never been there. The moment shattered like glass. I was back at the sink, the faucet still running, the water hot against my hands. My knees buckled, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. I told myself it was stress, just a brain glitch, but it happened again 2 days later. I was unlocking my apartment door when I suddenly found myself sitting in a diner booth. The table was sticky, and the air smelled of burnt coffee and syrup. A waitress with thick glasses and frizzy hair dropped a plate of pancakes in front of me. "You're a creature of habit," she said, grinning. I didn't know her. I didn't know the diner, but I knew the taste of the pancakes. I could feel the cheap metal fork in my hand, the buttery syrup soaking through the stack. And then, just like before, I was back in my own life, fumbling with my keys in the hallway. This time, I couldn't let it go. I started keeping a journal, jotting down every detail I could remember from these strange intrusions. The path with the gravel, the sticky diner booth, the faces of strangers who felt familiar in ways I couldn't explain. The memories came more frequently after that, as if acknowledging them had given them permission to grow. One minute I'd be sitting on my couch, scrolling my phone, and the next I'd be sitting in a classroom, doodling on a notebook. The teacher was someone I'd never seen before, but I knew her name, Mrs. Parks. The notebook wasn't mine, but I knew every mark on the page like I'd written them myself. I wasn't just remembering, I was living these moments as though I was someone else entirely. The line between my life and theirs started to blur. I'd wake up in my bed with the taste of mint chocolate ice cream on my tongue, but I hadn't eaten any. I'd hum songs I didn't know, but somehow the lyrics felt burned into my brain. Once, I found a shopping list on my counter, written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Toothpaste, eggs, candles, it read. Candles? I started searching for answers. Late nights spent poring over forums, reading about false memories, dissociation, time slips, even reincarnation. Nothing quite fit. I'd never had any gaps in my memory before, and these weren't flashes of some past life. They were too vivid, too now. And then, I found her. She was waiting for me in the memories. I didn't notice her at first. She was always on the periphery, blending into the background. A woman with long, dark hair, wearing the same pale green sweater every time. She'd be sitting on a bench as I walked down the gravel path. She passed by the diner window as I stared at my plate of pancakes. Once, she was standing at the edge of the classroom, her hands clasped behind her back, watching me. But the first time she spoke to me, I felt the air leave my lungs. I was in one of the memories again, walking down the gravel path. I could feel the sun on my skin, the warmth seeping into my bones. And then she stepped out of the trees. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice calm but firm. I froze. "This isn't your life," she added, tilting her head slightly, studying me. "Why are you in it?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the memory dissolved before I could answer. After that, she appeared in almost every memory, growing bolder each time. She'd sit across from me in the diner, silent but staring. She'd stand at the chalkboard in the classroom, erasing something I couldn't quite see. Once, she even followed me into my own apartment. I woke up gasping, her voice still echoing in my ears. "Stop pushing. You don't want to know." I should have listened, but I didn't. The more I thought about her, the more the memories bled into my reality. I'd see flashes of her in the reflection of a shop window or catch the faint scent of her perfume, lavender and something sharp metallic. The world started to feel wrong, like a TV show I'd accidentally walked into. And then, last night, she came to me for real. I woke up to find her sitting at the foot of my bed, her green sweater glowing faintly in the moonlight. "This is your last chance," she said. "Let it go. Stay where you belong." "What do you mean?" I croaked. Her face softened, almost like she pitied me. "If you keep digging, you'll find the truth, and it will destroy you." I reached out to her, desperate for answers, but she was gone. Now I'm sitting here, staring at this journal, wondering if she was right, if I should just stop. But I can't, because this morning, I found something in my apartment I can't explain. A green sweater. It smells like lavender. And blood. Let's start a new story. Extra cash. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy enough. Walk some dogs, feed a cat, water a plant or two. Most of my clients were middle-aged couples or retirees, the kind of people who left detailed instructions and promised to check in via text from their vacations. But then there was the Callaway job. That one was different. The Callaways were new in town. I'd never met them, only communicated through a series of curt emails. The job itself was simple. Feed their dog, Rupert, and let him out once a day. They offered double my usual rate because they were leaving on short notice. It was too good to pass up. When I arrived at their house for the first time, I was struck by how normal it was. A cookie-cutter suburban two-story with beige siding, a trimmed lawn, and a perfectly ordinary driveway. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The house was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silent, but the oppressive kind that makes your ears ring. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood or pennies left out in the sun. I chalked it up to nerves. New clients always made me anxious. Rupert, a black Labrador, greeted me with a wagging tail. He seemed friendly enough, and I quickly got to work filling his bowl. The instructions they'd left were simple, taped to the fridge. Satu, feed Rupert. 2. Let him out into the yard for 10 minutes. 3. Never leave him outside longer than 10 minutes. I remember laughing at that last one. What were they afraid of? A coyote? We were in the middle of suburbia. The first day was uneventful. Rupert ate, went outside, came back in, and wagged his tail like I was his best friend. I locked up and left, feeling a little silly for how uneasy I'd been earlier. But things changed the next day. When I arrived, Rupert wasn't at the door to greet me. He didn't come when I called his name either. My stomach tightened as I searched the house. I found him in the living room, staring at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. His body was rigid, his tail tucked between his legs, and he was growling softly at something outside. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Just the yard, bordered by a tall wooden fence. "What's out there, boy?" I asked, trying to sound lighthearted. He didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the glass, unblinking. I tried to coax him away with a treat, but he wouldn't budge. Eventually, I had to pick him up, no small feat with a dog his size, and carry him to the kitchen. He didn't eat that day, and when I let him out, he bolted into the yard, circling wildly as though searching for something. After exactly 10 minutes, I called him back in. He came reluctantly, his ears flat against his head, his body trembling. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I texted the Callaways to ask if Rupert had ever acted this way before. Their reply came hours later. Just follow the instructions. No explanación. No reassurance. Just that. The third day was when things got worse. When I arrived, Rupert wasn't just growling. He was barking, his teeth bared as he paced back and forth in front of the sliding door. His hackles were raised, and he kept lunging at the glass like he was trying to attack something. My heart pounded as I peered outside. At first, I didn't see anything. The yard looked the same as always, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. But then I noticed it, a dark spot near the fence just out of reach of the sunlight. It wasn't a shadow. It was too solid, too deliberate. I couldn't make out its shape, but the longer I stared, the more it seemed to shift, like it was alive. I stepped closer to the glass, squinting. The dark spot twitched, and then it moved. It slithered, long and low, like smoke curling along the ground. I stumbled back, instinctively grabbing Rupert's collar to keep him from lunging at the door. Whatever was stopped moving, but I could feel it watching me. Not see feel. I managed to get Rupert into the kitchen, though he fought me the entire way, his claws scraping against the tile. I locked the sliding door, double-checking it before letting him outside through the front door instead. I didn't even bother with the backyard. I stayed with him the full 10 minutes, clutching his leash like a lifeline. The neighborhood felt unnervingly quiet. No cars, no kids playing, not even the hum of distant lawnmowers. Just silence. I brought Rupert back inside and hurried out, locking up behind me without looking back. That night, I had a dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream. I was in the Calloway's backyard, standing in the same spot where I'd seen the dark shape. The fence loomed above me, taller than it should have been, casting long shadows that moved even though the wind was still. Something was behind me. I could feel its breath, hot and damp, against my neck. I couldn't move. When I woke up, my phone was buzzing. It was a text from the Callaways. Do not go into the backyard after dark. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. How could they have known? The next day was my last. I was too scared to go back, but I didn't want to abandon Rupert. When I arrived, the house was darker than usual. The lights were off, and the air inside was colder than it had any right to be. Rupert was in the living room, staring at the glass door again. But this time, he wasn't growling. He was whimpering. I didn't look outside. I couldn't. I just grabbed his leash and let him out the front door as fast as I could. This time, I stayed with him for exactly 10 minutes, counting each second under my breath. When I brought him back inside, I locked every door and window before leaving. That night, the Callaways texted me one last time. We're home. Thank you. That was it. No explanación. No questions about how Rupert had behaved. Just that. I never heard from them again. I stopped taking jobs after that. And sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up with the feeling that something is watching me. When I look outside, I swear I see a dark spot in the shadows, too solid, too deliberate, waiting just out of reach of the light. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed, it was in a photo. Just a regular snapshot. Me and my friend Julia's housewarming party, holding a drink and laughing at something off camera. Julia had posted it online, tagging everyone. I stared at it for a while, smiling at the memory, until something in the corner caught my eye. There was a figure in the background, half hidden in the shadows of Julia's hallway. Blurry, but definitely there. At first, I thought it was another guest, maybe someone I didn't know. But the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. The figure wasn't facing the camera. They weren't moving, just standing there, slightly hunched, arms hanging limp at their sides, like they'd been caught mid-step and forgotten what to do next. I texted Julia. "Who's the creeper in your hallway?" She replied almost immediately. "What are you talking about?" I sent her the screenshot, circled the figure. A few minutes later, she called me, her voice tight. "That's not possible," she said. "There was no one there. I checked every room before I went to bed." I laughed it off. Maybe it was a trick of the light or some weird digital artifact. But the unease lingered, a quiet buzz at the base of my skull. The next time it happened, I wasn't looking at a photo. I was at work. It was late, and the office was empty except for me. My co-workers had all left hours ago, and I was finishing up some reports. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic click of my keyboard were the only sounds. At least, that's what I thought, until I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the break room. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I stood, peering over the cubicle walls, but the office was empty. The steps continued, slow and steady, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed my phone, shining its flashlight toward the break room. Nothing. But as I turned to head back to my desk, I caught a glimpse of something in the glass partition. A shadow, faint and indistinct, moving behind me. When I spun around, there was no one there. I left the office that night without finishing my reports. Things escalated after that. At first, it was small. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. Movement in the corner of my eye. The sense that someone was standing just behind me when I turned off the lights. But then the photos started showing up. Every few days, I'd find a new one. printed on glossy paper. No sender, no return address. They were always pictures of me, walking to work, sitting in a cafe, watching TV in my apartment. Always taken from just far enough away that I hadn't noticed. Always with that same figure in the background, blurry and still, watching. I went to the police. They weren't much help. Probably a prank, the officer said, flipping through the photos. Do you have any enemies? A jealous ex, maybe? I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him about the footsteps, the shadows, the way my skin prickled whenever I was alone. But what could I say that didn't make me sound insane? I stopped going out as much. I quit my job and started working freelance. I covered my windows with blackout curtains and locked every door twice. It didn't help. The photos kept coming. They weren't just of me anymore. They show my apartment taken from impossible angles, like someone was standing inside. One night, I woke up to find a photo on my pillow, placed neatly beside my head. It was a picture of me sleeping. I couldn't stay there after that. I packed what I could fit in my car and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just disappeared. For a few days it worked. No photos, no shadows, no strange noises. I started to think maybe I'd escaped. Then I found the mirror. It was in the bathroom of the motel, an old, speckled thing that reflected more grime than light. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed the reflection behind me, dark, blurred, just out of focus. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. Closer now, and then it moved, not the way a reflection moves, following your actions. It tilted its head, slow and deliberate, its blurred face contorting as though it were trying to smile. My heart thundered as I stepped back, stumbling into the wall. The figure stayed where it was, staring. I didn't sleep that night. I don't know what it wants, but it's getting bolder. The photos aren't of me anymore. There are places I haven't been. A cabin in the woods, an abandoned playground, a long, dark road with no end in sight. I think it's trying to lead me somewhere. Yesterday, I got a package. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the front door of the motel room I'm in now. The photo was taken from the hallway. I haven't left the room since. I've locked the door, blocked the windows, shoved furniture against the walls. But tonight, as I'm writing this, I can hear it. The footsteps, slow, deliberate just outside the door. It knocked once, twice, 3 times, and now the doorknob is turning. Let's start a new story. Clothes, faint but unmistakable. It clung to the air in the empty house, curling into the corners of rooms she hadn't stepped into in years. She stood in the doorway, her overnight bag still slung over her shoulder, staring into the dim hallway. The house should have been silent, but it wasn't. It had a hum, a pulse, a faint creaking under its breath, as if it had been holding its tongue and was finally ready to speak. Nora stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The realtor had called it a charming fixer-upper when she'd bought it sight unseen, a desperate attempt to hold on to something after her mother's death. She hadn't grown up here. Her mother had moved to this tiny lakeside town after the divorce, but it was all Nora had left of her. The house had been in the family for decades, though, her mother used to say. A place of memories, of roots. But as Nora wandered through the narrow rooms, past peeling wallpaper and dust-coated furniture, it didn't feel like home. It felt like someone else's life, abandoned mid-sentence. She dropped her bag in the kitchen and turned on the sink. The water sputtered, brown at first, before running clear. She splashed her face and stared out the window above the sink. The lake shimmered in the distance, calm and glassy. A single swan floated on its surface, elegant and eerie. The sound came suddenly, a scrape like furniture dragged across the floor. Nora spun around, her heart thudding. "Hello," she called, her voice bouncing off the walls. No answer. She told herself it was an old house. Old houses creak. She glanced at the ceiling, wondering if the sound had come from upstairs. For a long moment, she stood frozen listening, but there was only silence now, thick and watchful. By the time she finished unpacking, the sun was beginning to set, filling the house with long shadows. She found an old lamp in the living room and plugged it in, the bulb buzzing faintly before casting its weak glow. She curled up on the couch with her laptop, planning to scroll through emails and distract herself from the unease crawling under her skin. The distraction didn't last long. She first noticed it when her laptop froze. She tapped at the keys impatiently, then tried restarting it, but the screen stayed black. And then she saw it, the faint outline of a reflection, not her own, in the darkened screen. Someone was standing behind her. Nora whipped around, but the room was empty. Her breathing was shallow now, her pulse hammering in her ears. She told herself she was imagining things, that grief and exhaustion were playing tricks on her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The scent of cinnamon and cloves grew stronger. She grabbed her phone and tried calling someone, anyone, but the screen wouldn't light up. Dead. She cursed under her breath and headed for the front door. The air outside would clear her head, she told herself. She wasn't running. Not yet. But the front door wouldn't open. The latch turned, but the door wouldn't budge, as if something heavy were pressed against it from the other side. She tried the windows next, but they were stuck, their frames swollen with age. A low sound echoed through the house then, rising from the floorboards. A hum, almost melodic. She turned, her back pressed against the door, and scanned the dim hallway. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The hum stopped, and then she saw it, a light flickering at the top of the staircase. It was faint, like candlelight, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Against every instinct screaming in her mind, she stepped toward it. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed. The light seemed to recede as she approached, pulling her deeper into the house. At the top of the stairs, she paused, staring into the open doorway of the master bedroom. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and sharp. Inside, a single candle burned on the windowsill. It flickered, casting light across the room, revealing something etched into the walls. Words carved deep into the plaster, looping and uneven. "I never left." Nora's breath caught in her throat. She backed out of the room, her heart pounding. As she turned to flee, she nearly tripped over something lying in the hallway, a small wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Inside was a bundle of old letters, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. She knelt down, her hands shaking, and pulled one out. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's. "To my dearest Nora," it began. She skimmed the words, her mind racing. The letter spoke of things her mother had never mentioned. A husband who wasn't Nora's father, a child lost long before Nora was born, and a house that refused to let go. "If you're reading this," the letter ended, "then the house has chosen you. It needs you. But be careful, my love. Not everything inside it is kind." A noise from the bedroom made her look up. The candle had gone out, plunging the room into darkness. But the shadows were moving now, shifting and twisting, as if alive. Nora ran, down the stairs, through the hallway, back to the front door. She pounded against it, screamed for help, but the house swallowed her cries. Behind her, the shadows were creeping closer, pooling like liquid, reaching for her. And then the voice came, soft and cold. "You can't leave." The door flew open. She tumbled outside, gasping for air, and scrambled to her car. She didn't look back until she was halfway down the gravel road. The house stood in the distance, dark and silent. The scent of cinnamon and cloves still lingered in her nose. Nora didn't stop driving until the sun came up. But even as daylight chased the shadows from her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped. The house wasn't done with her yet. Let's start a new story. I never thought much about elevators. They were just a convenience, a way to get from point A to point B without climbing a million stairs. But now, I can't stop thinking about them. Every time I see one, I wonder if it's the same one. It started on a Wednesday, one of those dreary midweek days where everything feels slow and unremarkable. I'd stayed late at the office, finishing a report that no one would appreciate, and by the time I left, the building was nearly empty. The elevator dinged as I pressed the button, and the doors slid open to reveal the same brushed steel interior I saw every day. I stepped inside, hit the button for the ground floor, and leaned back against the wall, letting my eyes drift shut. The ride felt longer than usual, but I didn't think much of it. Old elevators sometimes take their time, I figured. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into not the lobby. It was a hallway, dimly lit and lined with doors. I froze, confused, and stepped back into the elevator, checking the panel. The button for the ground floor was still lit. I pressed it again. The doors closed, the elevator hummed, and after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. When the doors opened, it was the same hallway. I stood there, heart racing, trying to process what was happening. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic, like old blood. I leaned out of the elevator, peering down the hallway. It stretched into darkness, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Against my better judgment, I stepped out, leaving the elevator behind. The carpet underfoot was threadbare, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that looked like it belonged in a 1970s horror movie. Each door I passed was identical, dark wood with brass numbers, though the numbers didn't make sense. They weren't in order: 203, 118, 502. Some were missing entirely, leaving rusted impressions where they'd once been. I reached for the handle of one door, but something stopped me. A sense of overwhelming wrongness washed over me, so strong that my hand shook. Instead, I turned back to the elevator, but it was gone. The space where it had been was now just a blank wall, seamless and featureless. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the wall, shouting for help. The hallway swallowed my cries. I don't know how long I wandered. Hours, maybe? Time felt slippery there, like it wasn't tethered to anything real. The hallway stretched on, doors on either side, but no intersections, no stairs, no windows. Just an endless, suffocating loop. And then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, her back to me. A woman in a plain gray dress, her hair hanging limp around her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay back, but desperation won out. "Hey," I called. She turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. It was me, not just someone who looked like me. It was me, down to the last detail. My face, my clothes, even the little scar on my chin from a bike accident when I was 12. She smiled, a cold, eerie smile that didn't belong on my face, and raised a hand, beckoning me forward. I didn't move. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You know who I am," she replied, her voice an exact match for mine. I shook my head, backing away. "No, this isn't real. This is some kind of dream, or..." "It's not a dream," she interrupted, taking a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. "You've been here before. You just don't remember." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but the words felt hollow. She laughed, a brittle, unnatural sound. "You will." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. When they came back on, she was gone. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was nowhere to go, but the fear propelled me forward, my footsteps echoing in the endless corridor. Eventually, I reached a door that was slightly ajar, light spilling out from the crack. I hesitated, but the alternative was the hallway, and I couldn't stay there. I pushed the door open. Inside was an elevator. Not the one I'd started in, but an older model with a scuffed brass panel and a manual gate. I stepped inside and pulled the gate shut, pressing the only button on the panel. The elevator groaned to life, the machinery creaking as it ascended. When the doors opened, I was back in my office building. The normal one, with the same sterile fluorescent lights and bland carpeting. But something was wrong. The office was empty, the desks abandoned, papers scattered as if people had left in a hurry. I checked my phone. The time and date were correct, but none of my messages or calls had been returned. And then I saw it. The elevator at the end of the hallway, the one I just stepped out of, was still open. And inside, staring back at me, was her. Me, smiling that same cold, unnatural smile. I ran, and I haven't stopped running. Every elevator feels like a trap now. Every reflection a potential betrayal. I don't know if I'm still in the real world, or if I ever escaped at all. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I'm not sure which one of us is real. Let's start a new story. Season. It was late, the kind of cold night where the air bites through your clothes no matter how many layers you're wearing. I just settled onto the couch with a blanket and a steaming mug of tea when I heard scratching at the front door. Not the polite scrape of someone knocking, but a frantic, desperate sound, as if the wood itself might splinter under the force. When I opened the door, the dog stumbled in like it had been waiting for hours. It was massive, easily the size of a small deer, with long, wiry fur the color of soot and mismatched eyes. One amber, one a cloudy blue. Despite its size, it looked gaunt, its ribs pressing against its skin like they were trying to escape. I hesitated, unsure. We weren't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but I lived far enough from the main road that a stray dog wandering up to my house was unusual. It didn't wear a collar, and its fur was matted with mud and something darker that I didn't want to think about. "Hey, buddy," I said cautiously, crouching down. The dog lowered its head, tail twitching, and stepped closer. When I reached out a hand, it pressed its wet nose into my palm and whined. I didn't have the heart to turn it away. I made a bed for it near the radiator. Using an old comforter I didn't mind losing. The dog curled up immediately, resting its massive head on its paws. I fetched it a bowl of water and some leftover chicken, which it devoured in seconds. For a while, I just sat nearby, watching its sides rise and fall in rhythm. There was something calming about its presence, though it also felt off. The dog didn't blink like normal dogs do. Its eyes stayed fixed on me, unblinking, even as its body rested. It wasn't threatening exactly, more like it was observing me, cataloging my every move. I shook off the unease and went to bed, hoping it would be gone by morning. It wasn't. When I woke up, the dog was sitting at the foot of my bed, staring. It startled me so badly, I almost fell out of the sheets. "Jesus!" I gasped, clutching my chest. The dog tilted its head, almost like it was amused. I didn't have work that day, thanks to the snowstorm, so I spent the morning calling around to see if anyone had reported a missing dog. No one had. I posted a picture of it on social media, asking if anyone recognized it. A few people commented mostly about how unusual it looked, but no leads. The dog followed me everywhere that day, its nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. If I went into the kitchen, it was at my heels. If I sat down to read, it settled nearby, always facing me. By the second day, it stopped eating, no matter what I offered. Canned food, fresh meat, even some of my own dinner. It turned its nose up. It wasn't losing energy, though. If anything, it seemed stronger. Its ribs weren't as prominent, and its coat looked shinier, fuller. And the noises started. At night, I began hearing strange sounds outside my house. Not just the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but things that didn't belong. A soft rustling in the snow, the faint creak of footsteps on the porch, and once, something that sounded like breathing outside my bedroom window. The dog would growl low and steady, its mismatched eyes locked on the door. By the fourth night, I was convinced someone or something was out there. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the breathing, slow and deliberate, just outside the window. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the living room. The dog was already there, standing in the middle of the room with its fur bristling. Its growl was so deep it felt like the floor was vibrating. When I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the window, there was nothing, just snow and darkness. But the dog didn't stop growling. Then I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just a single soft rap on the front door. I froze. No one knocks on doors at 2 a.m. during a snowstorm. Not out here. The dog turned its head toward the door, its growl growing quieter, almost thoughtful. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I walked slowly to the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The dog followed, standing so close to my leg, I could feel the heat radiating from its body. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just fresh snow, unbroken by footprints. I slammed the door and locked it. The dog sat down and watched me, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. For the first time, I thought I saw something in those eyes, something not entirely canine. That night, I dreamed of running. The snow was deep, slowing my legs, and I could feel something enormous chasing me. Its breath was hot on my neck, and when I glanced back, I saw those mismatched eyes glowing in the darkness. I woke up gasping, the dog sitting at my bedside again, its head tilted, as if it knew exactly what I'd seen. By the end of the week, the noises outside stopped, but the dog didn't leave. It settled into a routine, quiet and watchful, never barking or whining. I don't know why I haven't made it leave. Part of me thinks it's protecting me. From what, I don't know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knock again. Always soft, always deliberate. The dog hears it too. It never growls anymore. It just stares at the door, tail wagging slowly, like it's waiting for something or someone to finally come inside. Let's start a new story. Blurs, everything, headlights, street signs, faces. I wasn't supposed to be there. No one was. The library had been closed for 3 months, ever since the city cut funding for non-essential spaces. But the locks hadn't been changed and my key card still worked. I told myself it wasn't trespassing if I'd been a librarian there for years. Muscle memory had brought me back. The air inside smelled the same. Dust, old paper, and something faintly metallic. The silence was heavier than I remembered, thick enough to press against my ears. Without the hum of computers and the soft murmur of patrons, the building felt wrong. I flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of shelves that stretched into the darkness like endless tunnels. Part of me felt like a kid again, playing hide-and-seek in a space too big for my small body to fully understand. But another part of me, the adult part, knew I wasn't alone. I'd come for one reason: the ledger. It wasn't just any ledger. It was the ledger, a book so old it didn't have a title, only a cracked leather cover and brittle pages that smelled like the bottom of an antique trunk. It didn't belong to the library. Technically, it didn't belong anywhere. It had been in the archives for decades, untouched and undocumented, until I'd stumbled across it during an inventory sweep. What made the ledger strange wasn't its age or its contents. It was the fact that it had names, thousands of them, written in neat, faded script. Names that didn't show up in any database or public record. Names that felt off, like a dream you forgot the moment you woke up. And then the names started disappearing. It had been subtle at first. A blank space where a name used to be. A faint impression of ink, as if the paper had been erased, but not quite. I didn't think much of it until I realized the dates next to the names weren't birth dates or library card renewals. They were endings. That's when I stopped telling anyone about the ledger. I found it where I'd left it, in a locked drawer at the main desk. It felt heavier than I remembered, though maybe that was just the weight of knowing. I set it on the counter and opened it to the first blank spot. The flashlight beam caught the edge of the paper, illuminating the faint ghost of a name that had been there days ago. I ran my fingers over the page, half expecting it to hum beneath my touch. But it was just paper. Old, worn, ordinary paper. Why are you still here? The voice startled me. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting across the room, but there was no one there. Just rows of empty shelves and the rain tapping against the windows. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged like the space just before a thunderclap. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said again, closer this time. It was low and calm, neither threatening nor kind. "I worked here," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter. "I'm allowed." "Not anymore." I swung the beam toward the sound, but it landed on nothing. Just empty air. "What do you want?" I demanded. The voice didn't answer immediately. When it did, it was so close it felt like it was coming from inside my head. "You have the book." I glanced at the ledger, still open on the counter. "It's a library. There are a lot of books. Not like this one." My heart pounded against my ribs. "What's so special about it?" "It keeps track." "Of what?" The silence stretched thick and heavy. "Of you." A chill crept up my spine. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I wanted to argue, to laugh, to walk away. But my eyes drifted back to the ledger, to the names that had vanished. to the ones that remained. You think you found it by accident? The voice asked. I swallowed hard. What's that supposed to mean? The ledger finds you. When it's time. Time for what? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the rain outside grew louder, a steady drumbeat that seemed to echo inside my skull. I looked back at the ledger, at the blank spaces where names had once been, and then I turned the page. My name was there, written in the same spidery script, next to a date that wasn't today, but wasn't far off either. What is this? I whispered, my voice shaking. It's the record, the voice said simply, of what ends and what begins. I stared at my name, at the date, at the empty space beneath it, waiting for whatever came next. This isn't real, I said. The voice laughed softly, a sound that wasn't cruel but wasn't comforting either. Real or not, it's yours now. The ledger began to glow faintly, the ink shifting on the page like it was alive. My name shimmered, the date blurring until it was unreadable. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. The voice didn't respond. The glow faded. The silence returned. I stood there, alone in the empty library, the ledger heavy in my hands. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I knew one thing. I couldn't leave it behind. Let's start a new story. I always thought hitchhiking was a relic of the past, the kind of thing you'd see in old movies or hear about from people who lived in a different time. But a few months ago, I found myself driving along a lonely stretch of highway, and there he was, a man standing on the shoulder, thumb out, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the nearest town was still at least 50 miles away. I don't know why I stopped. I wasn't the kind of person who picked up strangers, too many horror stories, but something about the way he stood there so still and solitary tugged at me. Maybe I felt sorry for him. Maybe I was just curious. The man climbed into my car without a word, settling into the passenger seat like he belonged there. Up close, he looked younger than I'd first thought, maybe mid-30s. He had sharp features, dark eyes, and an odd, faintly amused expression, like he knew a joke no one else did. Thanks for stopping, he said finally, his voice low and smooth. Not many people do anymore. No problem, I replied, though I already regretted it. Something about him made my skin crawl, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Where are you headed? He tilted his head, considering the question. Nowhere in particular. You? Just passing through. He smiled at that, a quick flash of teeth. Aren't we all? We lapsed into silence, the hum of the tires the only sound. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through an empty landscape. The man didn't seem to mind the quiet. He just sat there, staring out the window, fingers drumming softly on his knee. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. So, what's your story? My story, he echoed, as if the concept amused him. I don't have one. Not anymore. Everyone has a story. Not everyone, he said, turning to look at me. His dark eyes seemed to glint in the fading light, and for a moment, I felt like he was staring straight through me. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease. Well, where are you coming from? Nowhere important. Okay, where are you going? He didn't answer. The road ahead seemed different now, though I couldn't say why. The sky was darker than it should have been, the stars obscured by a thick, unnatural haze. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the highway's cracked surface, but it felt like the light didn't reach far enough, like the darkness was pushing back. What's your name? I asked, hoping to break the tension. Does it matter? Kind of. I picked you up. It'd be nice to know who I'm talking to. He smiled again, that strange, unsettling grin. You can call me Jack. Jack, I repeated, gripping the wheel tighter. And you? Claire. Nice to meet you, Claire. The way he said my name sent a chill down my spine. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. The road was endless, and I realized I hadn't seen another car in ages. No headlights in the distance, no taillights fading ahead. Just me, Jack, and the suffocating dark. Why'd you stop for me? He asked suddenly. I don't know, I admitted. You look like you needed a ride. Kind of you, he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't identify. Yeah, well, I guess I'm just a kind person. he murmured, leaning back in his seat. Kindness can be dangerous, Claire. What's that supposed to mean? It means, he said slowly, you shouldn't pick up people like me. My heart stuttered. Why not? Because you don't know what I am. The words hung in the air, heavy and menacing. I glanced at him, and for the first time, I noticed something off about his reflection in the side window. It wasn't moving. I swerved, nearly driving off the road, and Jack laughed, a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. Relax, he said. I'm not going to hurt you. You need to get out, I said, my voice shaking. I can't. What do you mean you can't? You pick me up, he said simply. That means you're taking me where I need to go. And where's that? He turned to face me fully now, his grin gone, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. You'll see. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. Get out, I said again, louder this time. Jack didn't move. He just stared at me, unblinking. You can't leave me here, he said softly. Not now. Watch me. I threw the car in a park and jumped out, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my phone to call for help. But when I turned back to the car, Jack was gone. The passenger door hadn't opened. There was no sound of footsteps, no sign of him anywhere. Just the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath fogging in the cold night air. Finally, I got back in the car, locking the doors and driving as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station hours later, where the clerk gave me a strange look when I asked what highway I'd been on. There's no highway out there, he said. I didn't argue. I just nodded, bought a coffee, and drove until the sun came up. Sometimes late at night, I still think about Jack, about what he said, about where he was trying to go. And sometimes when I'm driving alone, I catch a glimpse of someone standing on the side of the road, thumb out, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. I don't stop anymore. Let's start a new story. I had flown into Denver for a conference and picked up a nondescript gray sedan from the airport lot. The kind of car you forget about the moment you park it. I barely paid attention as the rental clerk handed me the keys, rattling off the usual spiel about gas stations and toll fees. The first time I noticed something strange was when I pulled out onto the highway and saw the odometer. It read 0000013. Brand new. I've rented dozens of cars, but I've never been the first to drive one. There's always a few hundred miles logged by other travelers. This one, though, felt untouched. Even the air inside was sterile, as though no one had ever breathed in it before. I chalked it up to luck and drove to the hotel, but as I parked, the odometer caught my eye again. It now reads 0000011. I froze. I checked it twice, 3 times. Maybe I had read it wrong earlier. I hadn't driven far, maybe a dozen miles at most, but I was sure the number had been higher when I left the airport. By the time I got to my room, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of glitch. Numbers flip, technology isn't perfect. I left the car in the lot and tried to forget about it. The next morning, it got weirder. I walked out to the car at 8 a.m. sharp, coffee in hand, and stopped cold. The car wasn't where I'd parked it. At first, I thought it had been stolen, but then I spotted it 3 spaces over, facing the opposite direction. The keys were still in my pocket. My heart thudded as I approached. Everything looked normal, but when I checked the odometer again, it read 0000000. I called the rental company immediately, demanding an explanation. The woman on the other end of the line sounded bored, flipping through her script. Sometimes the odometer resets if there's a software update, she said. As long as the car's driving fine, there's no need to worry. But the car moved on its own, I said, my voice trembling. She laughed nervously. That's not possible. Maybe someone moved it by mistake. You're at a hotel, right? I hung up, but her words didn't settle me. I spent the rest of the day obsessively checking the car, making note of every detail. I parked it in the same spot when I returned that evening, snapping a picture for proof. At 2 a.m., the phone buzzed with an alert from my car rental app. Driver assist update complete. Safe travels, Mr. Hawthorne. My blood ran cold. I hadn't signed up for driver assist. I rushed to the parking lot, barefoot and shivering in the crisp night air. The car was gone. My stomach flipped as I scanned the lot, but then I spotted it, sitting on the far edge, headlights off, engine silent. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to lurch toward me, like some mechanical predator. When I reached the door, the interior lights flickered on. The odometer now read 999999. I opened the door slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. On the passenger seat was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't there before. I unfolded it with trembling hands. Written in bold, blocky letters was a single sentence. "Do not return me." I dropped the paper and staggered back, my chest tight with panic. The car's engine roared to life, the headlights flaring so brightly I had to shield my eyes. Then, as quickly as it started, it fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told the rental company I'd had an emergency and wouldn't be returning the car. They charged me a steep penalty, but I didn't care. I left it in the hotel lot and booked a flight home, swearing I'd never think about that cursed vehicle again. But the car wasn't done with me. 2 days after I returned home, it was there, parked across the street from my apartment. Same gray paint, same license plate. The odometer, now visible through the windshield, read 000013. My phone buzzed with another alert. Driver assist activated. Ready for pickup. I stared at the car, its presence a quiet, unrelenting threat. That night, I dreamed of endless highways stretching into darkness. The car always just ahead of me, its brake lights pulsing like a heartbeat. The next morning, I bought a bike. For weeks, the car followed me. It never came too close, never did anything overt, but I'd see it in parking lots, idling at stoplights, lurking at the edge of my vision. I started taking different routes to work, staying with friends, deleting my location data, but it didn't matter. The car always found me. Then one night it vanished. For a week, I thought it was over. My life felt almost normal again. But then the letters started arriving. The envelopes were blank, no return address, always delivered to my doorstep by hand. Inside were receipts, gas stations I'd never visited, hotels I'd never stayed at, tolls for roads I'd never driven. And always, at the bottom of each receipt, was a handwritten note. "I miss you." I burned the letters, deleted every app linked to my name, and moved across the country. But I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. Because sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear it, 3 quick taps on the window like fingers on glass. Let's start a new story. 2. I took it because I had no choice. My phone was dead. The last bus had already left, and walking along the main road in the dark felt like painting a target on my back. The forest path, though unsettling, cut the distance to my house in half. I figured I could endure the unease for 20 minutes. The entrance to the trailhead was marked by a wooden sign I'd passed 100 times but never really noticed. That night it felt different. The letters looked darker, almost charred, though I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the moonlight or my own nerves playing games with me. I hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the path, my breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The first 10 minutes were uneventful. The trees towered overhead, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that blocked most of the moonlight. I kept my head down, focusing on the crunch of leaves underfoot and the faint sound of wind rustling the treetops. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like a storm was brewing. I first noticed something was off when the sounds of the forest stopped. The chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, all of it disappeared in an instant, leaving an oppressive silence. I paused mid-step, straining to hear anything. That's when I became aware of a new sound. Footsteps, faint and deliberate, just behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the path was empty. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to laugh. "Okay," I muttered aloud, trying to fill the silence. "It's just your imagination. Keep walking." But as I turned back, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. I didn't hesitate. I broke into a run, adrenaline surging through my veins. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows thickening, the path narrowing. Branches clawed at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. The footsteps matched my pace, each one heavier than the last, like whatever was following me was gaining ground. I spotted a clearing up ahead and sprinted toward it, desperate to get out of the suffocating darkness. As I burst into the open, I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. The clearing was wrong. The trees formed a perfect circle around it, their branches reaching inward like skeletal fingers. In the center stood a stone well, ancient and crumbling, moss creeping over its edges. I'd never seen this clearing before. It wasn't on the trail. It wasn't on any map I'd ever studied. The footsteps stopped. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. But the path behind me was empty, just a dark tunnel of trees leading back into the woods. My breath slowed, and I tried to convince myself I was alone. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. Maybe the silence had gotten to me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. It came from the well. I took a step back, my legs trembling. The whisper grew louder, a low, guttural voice that didn't belong to anything human. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, each syllable sending chills down my spine. Against every instinct, I moved closer. The air around the well was colder, and the metallic smell from earlier was stronger here, almost choking. I peered over the edge, my stomach twisting with dread. The well was impossibly deep, its interior shrouded in shadow. But as I stared into the darkness, I realized something was staring back. Two faint points of light, like eyes, blinked slowly at me from the depths. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural laugh that echoed up from the well. The sound was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing against my ears. I turned and ran, tears streaming down my face. The forest seemed different now, the path unfamiliar, as if the woods themselves were shifting to keep me trapped. I pushed forward blindly, my only thought to get away. When I finally stumbled out of the trees and onto the street, I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The woods behind me were silent, the clearing nowhere in sight. A street light flickered overhead, and the faint hum of distant traffic grounded me in reality. I made it home that night, but something followed me. I know it. The shadows in my apartment feel too deep, the air too heavy. And last night, when I closed my eyes to sleep, I heard it again. That low, guttural whisper, faint but unmistakable. This morning, there was a puddle of water on my living room floor. At first, I thought it was a leak, but then I saw the footprints leading from it, dark and damp, disappearing into the shadows of my hallway. Let's start a new story. This morning, when I noticed the time, 9:47 p.m., I sighed, leaning back in my chair, and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, it was still 9:47. I figured the clock app on my laptop had frozen, so I checked my phone. It also said 9:47. That's when I glanced at the kitchen clock. Same time. I frowned, stood up, and walked over to the microwave. Its display was blank, which was odd. It was always on, even after a power outage. I checked my watch. 9:47. I thought about texting someone just to check if time was moving for them, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Hey, is time stuck where you are? I shook my head and went to the window instead, hoping to clear my mind. Outside, the world was still. It wasn't the kind of stillness you see late at night when the city sleeps. It was absolute. Cars on the street were frozen mid-motion, headlights casting sharp beams that didn't flicker. A bird hung in the air, wings extended, a perfectly paused moment of flight. The tree outside my window swayed slightly in a wind that no longer existed. My stomach clenched, and I stepped back, my breathing uneven. What the hell? I whispered to no one. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, aiming it at the street. Nothing moved in the live feed. But when I switched to video mode and hit record, the screen showed movement. The bird flapped its wings. The tree rustled. A man crossing the street turned his head to check for cars. I stopped the recording, my heart racing, and hit play. The video showed a completely normal street scene, everything moving exactly as it should. But when I lowered the phone, the world outside was frozen again. I didn't know what to do. For a while, I just sat on the couch, staring at my hands, trying to process what was happening. Time had stopped, or at least appeared to. But why was I still able to move? And why did the phone see things differently? I decided to test it. I grabbed a pen and notebook from the desk, then wrote the current date and time. April 14th, 9:47 p.m. Beneath that, I jotted down a few notes about what I'd seen outside. The act of writing felt grounding, like I was anchoring myself to reality. When I looked up, the clock on my laptop hadn't changed. But when I checked my notebook, the ink from my pen was gone. The page was blank. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. I flipped to the next page and wrote the same date and time again. This time, I didn't take my eyes off the words. For a moment, they stayed. Then, right in front of me, the ink faded, as if someone were erasing it from the page. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft, deliberate, and came from the front door. I froze. No one ever visited me this late. Hell, no one visited me ever. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But something about the knock felt wrong. Like it wasn't a request, but a command. I stood up and approached the door slowly, every step heavy with hesitation. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. The peephole was dark, as if someone were blocking it. My gut told me not to open the door, but my hand reached for the knob anyway, moving almost on its own. The door swung open, and I stepped back instinctively. No one was there, but just as I was about to close it again, I saw something on the ground. A small, black envelope, its surface smooth and glossy. There was no name, no address, just a faint shimmer in the overhead light. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. Inside was a single slip of paper, perfectly square and oddly cold to the touch. On it in sharp, precise handwriting was a message. "You've been noticed. Don't leave." I stared at the note, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. And yet, the words sent a chill down my spine, as though whoever wrote them was watching me right now. I shut the door, locked it, and slid the bolt across for good measure. Then I checked the windows, pulling the curtains tight. The hours that followed were a blur of paranoia and restless pacing. I kept checking the clocks, but they all remained stuck at 9:47. Outside, the world was still frozen, as though someone had pressed pause on the entire universe. And then I noticed something new. In the corner of the living room, just beyond the reach of the lamp's light, a shadow shifted. At first, I thought it was a trick of my imagination, a result of too little sleep and too much adrenaline. But the shadow moved again, detaching itself from the wall. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could define. Just a mass of darkness that rippled and stretched, its edges flickering like static. "You shouldn't have looked," it said. The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room, reverberating in my bones. "What are you?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it grew taller, its form elongating until it seemed to scrape the ceiling. The lights flickered, dimmed, and went out completely. In the darkness, the voice spoke again. "You were meant to pass through unnoticed, but you saw too much, and now we see you." I stumbled back, my hand searching for something, anything, to defend myself. But there was nothing, only the suffocating presence of the shadow, pressing closer. "What do you want?" I whispered, to correct the error. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and suddenly the air was gone. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world around me collapsed into a void, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I felt like I was unraveling, my very existence coming apart at the seams. When I woke up, I was sitting at my desk. The clock read 9:46 p.m. The report I'd been working on was unfinished, the page of my notebook blank. Outside, the world moved normally. Cars passing, people walking, leaves rustling in the breeze. For a moment, I let out a shaky laugh, relieved it was over. Then I noticed the black envelope sitting on the corner of my desk. Let's start a new story. I was the only kid who liked the smell of the library's basement. While my classmates stuck to the main floor, where the children's section was bright and filled with beanbag chairs, I'd sneak downstairs. The basement wasn't part of the library proper. It was where the overflow books were stored, old volumes no one checked out anymore. It smelled like dust and mildew, with the faintest whiff of ink that reminded me of something ancient and forgotten. I loved it. The basement wasn't off limits, but it might as well have been. The lights were dim, and the shelves were crammed so close together that it was easy to get turned around. I'd wander for hours, pulling random books and reading whatever strange sentences caught my eye. There was no order to the chaos. Old encyclopedias sat beside cookbooks. Leather-bound classics were stacked haphazardly with faded pulp novels. It was perfect. I found the book near the back of the basement, in a row I hadn't noticed before. The air there felt heavier, and the light from the overhead bulb barely reached the shelves. The book was lying on top of a crate, not shelved with the others. Its cover was black leather, cracked and soft, with no title or markings. It didn't even have a library tag. When I opened it, I almost dropped it. The pages were filled with tiny, cramped handwriting in dark red ink. At least I think it was ink. It looked more like dried blood. There were no titles, no page numbers, just line after line of jagged letters that didn't quite stay on the lines. I couldn't read it, but I felt like I understood it, like the shapes of the words made sense in a way I couldn't explain. I was mesmerized. "Hey," Mrs. Kell, the librarian, snapped me out of my trance. She'd come down to look for me, her stern face a little softer than usual. "You shouldn't be down here," she said. "We're closing soon." I hid the book under my jacket and nodded, promising to come back up. When she turned her back, I slipped the book into my backpack. I don't know why I didn't check it out properly. Something about the book made me feel like it wasn't supposed to be there, like it didn't belong in the library or anywhere else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I sat on my bed, the book in my lap, flipping through the pages. The words seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, the letters rearranging themselves. Some pages were filled with diagrams that looked like constellations or veins under a microscope. Others were just blank, the edges of the paper frayed and burnt. The more I stared, the more it felt like the book was alive, its cover pulsing faintly beneath my hands. I should have been scared, but I wasn't. I felt drawn to it, like the book was waiting for me to understand it. That's when the knocking started. It was faint at first, like a soft tap 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 at the window. I froze. My bedroom was on the second floor. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I turned toward the window, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the reflection of my room in the dark glass. But then the reflection changed. It was subtle at first. My reflection lingered a second too long after I moved, its head tilting slightly to the side. Then it smiled. I wasn't smiling. The reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass. The skin warped and gray like it had been underwater for too long. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. The knocking grew louder, echoing through the room. I backed away, clutching the book to my chest. "Give it back." The reflection mouthed, the words forming on its lips. Its eyes, my eyes, darkened, turning into black pits that seemed to swallow the light. The knocking was deafening now, not just at the window, but at the walls, the door, the floor beneath my feet. "Give it back." I threw the book onto the floor, and the knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. The reflection was gone. The window, just a window again. I stared at the book, its cover rippling as if something were moving beneath it. Then it started to open, the pages flipping wildly on their own, faster and faster until they became a blur. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, suffocating. A low hum filled my ears, rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The book stopped on a blank page, and I saw my name written in that same dark red ink. Below it, the words, "You owe us." The lights in my room flickered, and for a moment I saw them. Figures standing in the shadows, their shapes long and thin, their faces featureless. They surrounded me, their heads tilting in unison, watching, waiting. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, my dad was shaking me awake. The book was gone, my room just as it had been. I tried to tell him about it, but he just chalked it up to a nightmare. I haven't been back to the library since, but sometimes at night I hear knocking at the window, and in my dreams, I I see the book waiting for me in that dimly lit basement, its pages open to a blank space where my name should be. Let's start a new story. Like garbage or rotting food, but something faint and persistent. Metallic like pennies. I noticed it the moment I stepped into my apartment after work. I checked the kitchen sink, the garbage can, even the vents, but everything was clean. The smell was everywhere, but nowhere in particular. Impossible to pin down. I figured it was some weird plumbing issue and went about my evening. By the next morning, it was gone, and I didn't think about it again until it came back a week later. This time it was stronger. That same coppery tang, just faint enough to feel like it was playing tricks on me. It clung to the air like a whisper, following me from room to room. I checked the pipes under the sink, the bathtub drain, even the closet where I kept my shoes, but I couldn't find a source. I decided to call maintenance in the morning. That night, I dreamed of running water. I could hear it rushing somewhere nearby, cold and endless, echoing like it was coming from deep underground. When I woke up, the smell was so strong it felt like it was sitting on my chest. The maintenance guy came that afternoon. He was a gruff, middle-aged man with tired eyes and a toolbox that looked older than I was. He sniffed the air when he walked in, but didn't seem concerned. "Probably the pipes," he said. "These old buildings, you know?" He poked around for a while, tapping on walls and running the faucets, before shrugging and telling me he didn't see anything unusual. "Let me know if it gets worse," he said as he left. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The smell wasn't the only thing. I started noticing little things out of place in my apartment. My coffee mug, which I always left on the counter, would be in the sink when I got home. A book on my shelf would be facing the wrong way, its spine hidden. My phone charger would be coiled neatly on the table instead of the tangled mess I'd left it in. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I live alone, and my building is secure. No one could have gotten in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Then came the taps. They started faintly, almost imperceptible at first, like the sound of a distant branch hitting a window. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. They seemed to come from the walls, just behind my bed. One night, after hours of staring at the ceiling, I pressed my ear against the wall. The tapping stopped instantly, replaced by silence so heavy it made my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings make noises, don't they? But then, just as I started to pull away, I heard it. A breath, slow and measured, like someone trying not to be heard. I jumped back, heart pounding, and scrambled for my phone. I called the building manager, who came up the next day with the same maintenance guy in tow. They knocked on the walls, checked the neighboring apartments, and even went down to the basement. Nothing. "No one's been in the vacant units," the manager said, looking slightly annoyed. "I'll send someone to check the insulation, but honestly, it's probably just the building settling." I nodded, pretending to believe him, but I knew what I'd heard. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I found the photograph. It was sitting on my kitchen table, a small, square Polaroid I didn't recognize. My hand shook as I picked it up. It was a picture of my bedroom, taken from the corner near the closet. The bed was neatly made, and the curtains were drawn, just as I'd left them. Except for one detail. In the photo, there was a figure standing next to the bed. It was blurry, just an outline, but unmistakable, a tall, shadowy shape leaning slightly forward, as if watching. I called the police immediately. They arrived within minutes, taking the photo and sweeping the apartment for any sign of a break-in. There was nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. Could someone have gotten in through the windows? I asked, my voice trembling. The officer shook his head. "You're 3 stories up, and these windows lock from the inside." I spent the next few nights at a friend's place, too afraid to go back. But I couldn't avoid my apartment forever. When I finally returned, everything felt wrong. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the smell, that awful metallic smell, was back. I decided to set up a camera. It wasn't fancy, just an old webcam connected to my laptop. I positioned it to face my bedroom and set it to record overnight. Part of me hoped it would catch something, but another part hoped it wouldn't. The next morning, I hesitated before hitting play. The video was grainy and dark. the room lit only by the faint glow of my alarm clock. For hours, nothing happened, just stillness. And then, at 3:14 a.m., the closet door creaked open. Slowly, deliberately, a figure stepped out, tall and lean, moving with an eerie, deliberate grace. They stood at the foot of my bed for what felt like an eternity, watching me sleep. Then, without a sound, they turned and walked out of frame. The video ended there. I didn't pack. I didn't call anyone. I just left. That was 3 months ago. I moved across the city, changed my number, and haven't been back to the building since. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a whiff of something metallic, faint and fleeting. And I wonder if they found me again. Let's start a new story. Woke up at my usual time, made my usual coffee, and went through the motions of a routine I'd practiced for years. It was so ordinary, so painfully mundane, that I wouldn't have remembered the day at all, if not for what happened when I left my apartment. The hallway smelled different. It was faint, but unmistakable, like burnt sugar mixed with wet earth. I wrinkled my nose and stepped into the corridor, but something made me hesitate. The lighting was wrong. The flickering fluorescent bulb above me, which had been dying a slow death for months, was now perfectly steady. The shadows it cast were too sharp, too precise, like they'd been drawn with a ruler. I told myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination. But as I walked to the stairs, I had the strangest sensation. The carpet beneath my feet didn't feel like carpet. It was too firm, too smooth, like I was walking on painted concrete. I crouched down, pressing my fingers into the fibers. They looked like carpet, but when I touched them, they were cold and unyielding, as if the texture was just an illusion. Something was wrong. I should have turned around and gone back inside. But I didn't. I told myself I was being ridiculous and took the stairs 2 at a time, brushing off the unease clinging to me like cobwebs. The street outside looked fine at first glance. The cars passed, people strolled by, and the sky was the same dull gray it always was in November. But the air had that same strange scent, burnt sugar and wet earth. And the longer I stood there, the more I realized things weren't moving the way they should. The cars weren't slowing down, not at stoplights, not at crosswalks, not even when people stepped in front of them. Pedestrians were walking in perfect synchronicity, their strides matching as though they were all part of the same silent march. No one noticed me. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my heart racing, but not a single person turned their head. It wasn't like they were ignoring me. It was like I wasn't there at all. I thought I was losing my mind until I saw her. She was the only one who seemed out of place. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing perfectly still in the middle of the street. Her head tilted slightly, her dark eyes fixed on me. "Hey," I called, my voice breaking the eerie silence. She didn't answer, but she smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something older, sharper, like she'd been waiting for me. And then she turned and ran. I don't know why I followed her. I'd like to say it was instinct or concern or some noble sense of responsibility. But the truth is I was afraid to stay where I was. She moved quickly, darting through alleys and cutting across streets without ever looking back. I lost her several times, but every corner I turned, she was there, just far enough ahead to keep me chasing. Finally, she stopped. We were in an empty lot surrounded by crumbling buildings. The ground beneath my feet was cracked asphalt, the air heavy with that same sweet, rotting smell. The girl was standing in the center of the lot, her back to me. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where are we?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach knotting, and froze. It was my apartment building. At least, it looked like my apartment building. Same brick facade, same cracked windows, same peeling paint on the fire escape. But it wasn't in the right place. It shouldn't have been here, in this lot miles from where I'd started. "What is this?" I whispered. The girl didn't respond. When I turned back to her, she was gone. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the building. Something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to step inside. And against every instinct screaming at me to run, I did. The lobby was identical to the one I'd left that morning. down to the crooked no smoking sign and the faint smell of mildew. But the air was still, too still, like the building itself was holding its breath. I climbed the stairs to my floor, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. My apartment door was open, just a crack, as if it had been left that way for me. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The mug for my morning coffee was still on the counter, the blanket I'd tossed on the couch still rumpled. But when I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. And then I heard the footsteps. They came from above, below, and around me, all at once. Heavy, deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I ran to the window and looked outside, but the street was gone. In its place was the empty lot, the cracked asphalt spreading endlessly into the horizon. The sky was dark, not with night, but with something thicker, heavier, like a storm that wouldn't break. And then I saw them. The people. They were standing in the lot, hundreds of them, motionless. Their faces were blank, their eyes black pits, all staring up at my window. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panic gasps, and bumped into something solid. When I turned, the girl was standing there. She was smiling again, that same too-old smile, her head tilted like she was curious. "What do you want?" I whispered. "You're home," she said, her voice echoing like it didn't belong to her. "We've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you to see." "See what?" Her smile widened. "That you've always been here." The words hit me like ice water, and I stumbled backward, clutching my chest. Memories, my memories, flooded my mind, but they weren't mine. They were of this place, this building, these people. Memories of watching, waiting, becoming. And then I understood. I hadn't left my apartment that morning. I never had. I was part of it now. I always had been. Let's start a new story. Know every inch of it. Every field, every creek, every overgrown trail that snakes through the woods. But I learned the hard way that some places don't want to be found, no matter how many times you've walked by them. It started with the deer. I was hiking with my dog, Max, a burly shepherd mix who acted like a tough guy, but was really a coward when the mood struck. We'd gone out for our usual loop, a narrow trail that wound through the trees and up to a ridge overlooking the valley. It was peaceful, quiet. Too quiet, I realized after a while. The forest, usually alive with the hum of insects and birds, felt muted. Ava much noticed. His ears perked, his steps hesitant, his nose twitching as if the air smelled wrong. Then we saw it. A deer stood in the middle of the trail, completely still. Not grazing, not moving, just standing. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes didn't look right. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting the sunlight like twin mirrors. Max growled, a low, uncertain sound. He never growled at animals. He was more likely to chase them or, in the case of a raccoon we once encountered, hide behind me. I tugged his leash gently. "Come on, buddy. Let's go around." But as I stepped off the trail, the deer moved. Not toward me, not away, just sideways, a jerky, unnatural shuffle that kept it squarely in our path. Its head twitched, snapping to the other side, but its body didn't follow. My stomach churned. Max barked once, sharp and loud. The deer didn't flinch. Instead, it opened its mouth. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the soft bleat of an animal. But what came out was a sound I'll never forget. It was low and garbled, like a tape recorder being played backward, layered with something almost human. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. Max barked again, more frantic this time, and yanked at the leash, pulling me away. I didn't argue. We turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the deer's distorted cry echoing behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the clearing near the old water tower, the one where the forest opened up just enough to let the sky in. Max was panting, his fur bristling as he scanned the tree line. That's when I noticed it. The air was wrong here too. It felt heavy, like standing in a room where someone had just been yelling, the tension still clinging to the walls. The sunlight seemed dimmer, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. And then I saw the door. It shouldn't have been there. It was freestanding, no frame, no walls, just a single wooden door leaning slightly, as if it had been dropped there by mistake. The paint was peeling, the wood warped, and yet it looked solid. Real. Max growled again, his tail tucked between his legs as he backed away. I should have left. Any sane person would have. But there was something about the door, something magnetic. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was more like a pull, an invisible thread tugging at my chest. Against every ounce of better judgment, I stepped forward. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible now despite the warm afternoon. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. It was freezing. Max barked behind me, snapping me out of whatever trance I was in. I turned, ready to grab his leash and bolt, but the clearing wasn't empty anymore. The deer was there, only it wasn't just one. There were more, half a dozen at least, standing in a loose circle, their heads tilted at those unnatural angles, their eyes gleaming like polished glass. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. The pull grew stronger, dragging me toward the door, even as every instinct screamed to run. I gripped the knob tighter, my mind a whirlwind of panic and fascination. And then, without thinking, I opened it. The world didn't end. No beams of light, no dramatic music. Just silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. The door swung inward, revealing nothing but darkness. Not the kind of darkness you get when the sun sets, but a deep, oppressive blackness that seemed alive, like it was waiting for me to step inside. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to see anything, a shape, a glimmer, a hint of what lay beyond. But the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the silence shattered. Voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping in a cacophony of whispers and shouts. Some were angry, others pleading, a few laughing. A sound so sharp it felt like nails against my skull. I yanked my foot back, slamming the door shut. The voices stopped instantly, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the distant hum of insects. The clearing was empty. The deer were gone. I stood there, my chest heaving, the cold metal of the doorknob still biting into my palm. When I finally let go, the door creaked, leaning slightly to one side as if it had been there forever. Max whined, nudging my leg, and I realized we needed to leave. Now! We didn't stop until we were back at the car, the hike forgotten, the eerie pull of the woods left behind. I haven't been back to that trail since. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I hear it, the faint sound of a door creaking open, followed by the whispers. A bit louder now, closer, and I can't shake the feeling that the door didn't just lead to something. It let something out. Let's start a new story. I've been a rideshare driver for 6 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the night shift attracts all kinds. Drunks, weirdos, lovers, and whispered arguments. It's part of the job. I'd seen it all, until the night I picked her up. It was just past midnight, and I was cruising the usual late-night hotspots downtown when the ride request came in. The pickup point was in the warehouse district, a place where streetlights are rare and shadows swallow everything. The passenger's name on the app was Just E. I almost skipped it. Solo pickups in places like that usually spell trouble. But the surge pricing was in effect, and my rent wasn't going to pay itself. So I accepted. When I pulled up, I didn't see anyone at first. The street was silent, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Your own breathing, the hum of your engine. I was about to cancel the ride when I spotted her stepping out of the shadows. She was tall and pale, her dark hair hanging in damp, stringy waves around her face. She wore a long black coat that seemed to swallow her thin frame. She didn't look drunk or disheveled, but there was something off about her. She moved like she was gliding rather than walking, her steps too smooth, too deliberate. She opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. No greeting, no awkward small talk, just silence. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her face partially obscured by her hair. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. "Where to?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror. They were wrong. Too dark, like there weren't any whites. Just endless black. She didn't blink. "The end," she said softly. I chuckled nervously. That's pretty vague. Can you, be more specific? She leaned forward, her face coming closer to the gap between the seats. Drive, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll tell you when to stop. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I shifted into drive. The app showed no destination, just a pulsing blue that tracked my location. I tried to make conversation, hoping to ease the tension. Late night for you? I asked, my voice betraying a faint quiver. She didn't respond. Her gaze never wavered from the window. The drive stretched on, the city fading into empty streets and unlit fields. The longer we drove, the more the GPS started to glitch. The map zoomed in and out at random, the roads twisting into impossible loops before snapping back into place. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Look, I said, gripping the wheel tightly. I need an address, or I can't keep going. She didn't answer, but she shifted slightly in her seat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her hand move toward her pocket. My heart skipped. Was she pulling a weapon? My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Instead, she pulled out a small object and placed it on the seat next to her. A coin. It caught the faint glow of the dashboard lights, glinting dully. Keep driving, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but my mouth went dry. Something about her made defiance seem dangerous. The road began to change. The asphalt cracked and faded until it wasn't asphalt at all, but a hard-packed dirt path surrounded by trees. The headlights illuminated gnarled branches that twisted together like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sky. There was no way this path was on any map. Here, she said abruptly. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. We were in a clearing now, the dirt road ending in a perfect circle surrounded by trees. The silence was absolute. No insects, no wind, just a faint hum of my engine. She opened the door and stepped out, the coin still lying untouched on the seat. For a moment, she just stood there, staring into the trees. Then she turned to face me. Don't wait, she said. What the hell is this? I blurted out, my voice cracking. Where are we? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. You shouldn't have come this far, she said. But you did. Before I could respond, she walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as if the trees had swallowed her whole. I sat there, paralyzed, the engine idling. Part of me wanted to drive off immediately, but another part, an irrational, terrified part, was afraid that if I did, she might somehow end up back in the car. Watching. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to grab the coin. It was cold, too cold, like it had been sitting in ice water. It was heavier than it looked, and the design on it was strange. Not any currency I recognized, just an intricate engraving of interlocking circles and symbols that made my eyes hurt if I stared too long. I slammed the door shut and reversed out of the clearing, the dirt crunching under my tires. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, the sight of streetlights almost bringing me to tears. When I checked the app, the ride was still active. I ended it immediately, but instead of calculating the fare, the app glitched out, displaying nothing but static before closing itself. I deleted the app that night and quit driving altogether, but the coin stayed with me. I couldn't throw it away. Every time I tried, whether it was the trash, the river, or leaving it somewhere far from home, it always ended up back on my nightstand the next morning. And now, sometimes late at night, I hear her voice. Drive. And I wonder if the next time I pick it up, it'll be my turn to find out where the road ends. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed it, I was sitting in my living room watching TV, a nature documentary. I don't even remember which one. I was halfway through a scene of lions stalking gazelle when the screen froze. Not unusual. My streaming service glitches now and then. I waited for it to buffer, but instead of continuing, the screen went black for a moment before flickering back to life. The lions were gone. So was the narrator's soothing voice. Instead, there was a live feed of my living room. I blinked, certain I'd imagined it. But no, it was unmistakable. The couch I was sitting on, the mug of tea on the coffee table, the jacket I'd draped over the back of the chair. And me. I was there, on the screen, watching myself watch the screen. For a second, I thought it was some kind of weird, unannounced promotion by the streaming service, like a personalized ad or an augmented reality gimmick. But then I noticed something odd. The version of me on the screen wasn't doing exactly what I was doing. I lifted my hand slowly, waving tentatively at the TV. The me on the screen didn't wave back. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly, as if studying me, their expression unreadable. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The screen flickered again, and the feed disappeared. The documentary resumed as if nothing had happened, the lions now feasting on their prey. I turned off the TV. For days, I told myself it was a glitch, some kind of bizarre technical error that I couldn't explain but didn't need to understand. I even went online looking for similar experiences. I found nothing, though I did stumble across some old message boards full of conspiracy theories about televisions as surveillance devices. I laughed at that, nervously. The second time it happened, there was no ignoring it. It was late at night, and I was in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to lull myself to sleep. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the screen, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the house settling and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When my phone buzzed, I assumed it was a notification, a spam email, or maybe a news alert. But the notification banner was blank. No text, no icon, just a pulsating dot. I frowned and tapped it. The screen immediately switched to a live feed of my bedroom. My breath hitched. The angle was wide, like a security camera, capturing the entire room. The bed, the nightstand, the pile of laundry I'd been avoiding, and me, staring at the phone in horror. I turned the phone over, as if that would stop it, and scanned the room. There was no camera, no hidden device that I could see. But the feed continued, the image clear and steady. On the screen, I saw myself looking around frantically, mirroring my actions. But as I watched, the feed version of me did something I hadn't done. They smiled. Not a casual, fleeting smile, but a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that sent a chill down my spine. Then the feed cut out, and my phone returned to its home screen. I dropped it like it had burned me, my heart racing. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every sound seemed amplified. I unplugged the TV, the laptop, even my smart speaker, convinced that one of them must be the source of the feed. But it didn't help. It kept happening. Not just on my TV or phone, but on other screens too. The security monitor at work, which flickered briefly to show me sitting at my desk. The digital display at the gas station, where I saw myself standing at the pump, even though I was still in the car. The screen at the pharmacy self-checkout, which showed me walking down an aisle I hadn't even been to yet. And always, the other me was just a little off, a little too calm, a little too deliberate in their movements, and always smiling. By this point, I'd stopped trying to explain it. I just wanted it to stop. I started avoiding screens as much as possible. I turned off my phone, avoided TVs, even taped over the camera on my laptop. But the harder I tried, the worse it got. I'd catch my reflection in a window, only to realize it wasn't moving with me. Or I'd glance at the blank surface of a turned-off monitor and see a faint outline of that same eerie smile. One night, I came home to find my living room rearranged. Not drastically, just enough to make it unsettling. The couch was pushed a few inches to the left. A book I'd left on the coffee table was now on the armrest. The blinds were half drawn when I always left them open. I stood there, frozen, until I noticed the TV was on. I hadn't turned it on. The screen showed the live feed of my living room. And on the couch, sitting casually, was the other me. They turned their heads slowly, meeting my gaze through the screen, and their smile widened. I ran. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, panting and trembling in the cold night air. I couldn't go back. I couldn't face whatever was in that apartment. Now I stay in motels, hopping from place to place, trying to stay ahead of it. But it doesn't matter where I go. It always finds me, the other me, watching, waiting, smiling.